Welcome to Savage Harry. Today's adventure. What if Harry Potter was raised by Voldemort as his chosen heir instead of his greatest enemy? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The curse that rebounded and lingered. The wand came up. There is in the practice of casting a moment which good duelists learn to read and bad ones learn to fear. The inch of stillness before the wand commits. Lord Voldemort had not been a bad duelist in nearly 50 years. He felt the inch, took it, and gave the killing curse to the air with the precision of a man laying a coin on a table. The green light went out from his wand in a clean line and met the forehead of a child who, by every reasonable accounting, ought to have died. The child did not die. That was the first surprise of the evening, and Lord Voldemort had not been surprised by anything since the day he learned at 16 that the headmaster of his school had been afraid of him. He had walked through the cottage at Godric's Hollow with a fastidious sense of arrangement. He had stepped over the husband in the hall, a husband who had pointed an empty fist at him, which was almost touching, and climbed the narrow stair, and entered the nursery, and offered the mother one of his rare offers. He liked offers. They were instructive. They sorted the world into those who took them and those who refused them, and they spared him certain inconveniences. She had refused. He had cleaned that up. There were yellow stars on the wallpaper, painted in the uneven way that mothers paint stars, and a mobile turning above the cot, and at the center of it all the round face that the prophecy had named. He had said the words. The light had gone where he had pointed it. And then the world had changed under him, the way a floor changes when a man steps off a stair he thought was there, and was not. He felt his ribs open before he felt the pain. He felt his vertebrae rearrange themselves before he felt the surprise. Every horcrux inside him snapped taut, as harpstrings will snap taut against a hand that strikes them, and the chord that came out of him was not music. It was the sound of an arrangement coming apart in the order it had been put together. The chair before the desk before the room before the house before the world. Voldemort observed all of this with the detached clarity of a man watching his own pocket being picked. There would be time for outrage later. First, there was the technical problem. He was unbinding. The body, that elegant, deliberate body he had built up over 20 years of cold research, that he had carried out of the basin of the dead at 28 and never looked back from, was no longer a place he could stay. The body was opening, the way a sealed letter opens when the wax has been heated. He could feel the cord of life inside him fraying, and he could feel each horcrux turn its face toward him and ready itself to catch him. The diary, he thought, somewhere in Wiltshire at the Malfoys. The ring at Little Hangleton beneath the floor. The cup at Gringotts in the vault of a fool, the locket in a cave he had not visited in 50 years, the diadem in the room. 6 anchors and a 7th in the snake. 7, he thought, adequate. And then while the 7th fragment was preparing to leap, he saw the 8th. It was very small. It was not a thing he had made. It was a wound, a piece of him torn loose by the rebound of his own curse, a chip of soul lifted free as a chip of china is lifted free of a cup. He observed it in the half-second before it found its housing. He had time in that half-second to recognize the housing it was going to find. It was the nearest available soul that did not have a defense. It was a soul which had been struck, that night, by the same curse that had unmade him. It was an open door. The chip went into the child's forehead like a seed into prepared earth. There was, at the moment of lodging, a sensation Voldemort had not predicted. It was the sensation of recognition, not in him, but in the chip, as a key recognizes a lock for which it had not been cut, and yet, by the surprising tolerance of certain old hardware, opens. The wound on the brow welcomed the wound that was a soul. The two raw places met. The flesh of the child closed up around the fragment as healthy flesh closes around a splinter that the body has not yet learned to push out. Already the splinter was sending its first signal home. The tether existed. He noted that. He marked it. He understood immediately and without celebration what the tether implied. It implied that he was not, at this moment, dying so completely as the architecture of the curse had been written to make him die. It implied that his curriculum of self-preservation, which he had assumed to be exhausted at 7 anchors, had quietly admitted an 8th. It implied that the prophecy had bound the boy to him, in a sense the speaker of the prophecy could not possibly have meant. He felt briefly a flicker of a thing which in a living body would have been amusement. The curse had bound the boy to him. The boy was now, in the literal sense, a vessel of him. A wizard who had spent his life mocking the doctrine of love had, in the moment of his unmaking, performed a parody of the only sacrament that doctrine recognized. He had given of himself to a child. It would be unwise, he thought, to allow this irony to settle into a feeling. He set it aside. The body of Lord Voldemort hit the floor in a fine ash. The black robe collapsed in on nothing. The wand rolled with a small wooden click and rested against the leg of the cot. The wraith stood up. It was not a standing, there was nothing to stand on. There was an orientation, a way of being present to the room which had a direction and a posture, and from the wraith's point of view it had risen out of the ruin of itself and looked down. The room held three bodies, the woman's husband on the stairs, and the boy who would not stop screaming. The boy was screaming with the loud, whole-throated outrage of an infant who has been touched without permission. There was a cut at his hairline shaped like a stroke of lightning. Blood ran along the small, straight nose. He kicked his short legs in the cot and continued to be alive. The wraith was not, strictly speaking, capable of fury. It tried and found that fury required something it no longer possessed, a chest to hold breath, a tongue to make heat, a stomach to drop. What remained of it was a shape made of attention and grievance, with no engine for the grievance. It hung in the rafters of the nursery like smoke that had forgotten the fire. It looked at the boy, and the boy looked nowhere in particular, and the boy went on shrieking. It thought then with the clarity of a clean instrument, "He is mine now." The thought arrived without affect. It was structural. The horcrux in the scar was a tether. The wraith was the other end of the tether. The wraith could go where the tether led. The wraith could not, in its current state, be more than a presence. It could not raise a wand or hold a cup of tea. It could not light a candle or sign its name. But it could be here, near this child, and it could be intimate with this child in a way the world had not yet learned to defend against. It was a useful inventory. The wraith waited. After some interval that it did not attempt to measure, there were footsteps on the lawn and then heavier footsteps on the stairs, and a man the size of a small wardrobe came into the room. The man had a beard like an unkempt cop's and eyes wet with grief. He picked the boy out of the cot with hands too gentle for their dimension, and he stood over the woman's body and made a long, low sound which the wraith identified as weeping. The wraith disliked weeping. It had always considered it a poor use of the throat. The wardrobe man wrapped the child in a blanket. He carried him down through the wreck of the lower stair and out into the lane. Outside, the night was cold in a way the wraith felt only as information. The breath of the wardrobe man came out in a cloud, and the wraith adjusted to follow. The motorbike was an indignity. It descended out of the air with the noise of an angry kitchen. It was held aloft by a charm of vulgar amplitude, and at its handlebars sat a young man with hair the color of wet straw who looked, even through the wraith's narrow attention, as though he had been crying for hours. The wardrobe man passed the child to the straw-haired man, who held the bundle as though it were the only solid thing in a moving world. There was a brief exchange the wraith did not bother to register. Then the straw-haired man bent forward over the handlebars, and the bike rose, and the wraith rose with it. It went up into the air with a sense of dignity it had not previously thought to want. Below it, the village of Godric's Hollow shrank to a pattern of streetlights and steeples, and one house with the roof partially open to the cold. The wraith looked down at the house once. There was nothing in it that interested it any longer. It paused mid-air in the cold above the spire of the village church to take stock of its assets. The first asset was the tether. The tether was an unprecedented instrument and would require thought. The wraith had read every reputable account of partial discorporation he had been able to locate in the libraries of 2 continents, and none of them described what he had now. The closest analog was a Bulgarian text from the 14th century, which described a sorcerer who had, by accident, lodged a fragment of his consciousness in the body of his own murderer. The text said the fragment had survived 11 days. The sorcerer had used those 11 days to teach the murderer one sentence in the language of the dead, which had then been spoken by the murderer in his sleep and had killed him. The wraith intended to do better than 11 days. The second asset was the body of knowledge already inside him. The body of knowledge had been his life's work. He had memorized, over 50 years, the genealogies of the great families and the topographies of the great vaults and the inflection points of the long British argument between blood and accommodation. He had memorized the maps of all the magical schools in Europe. He had memorized the patrol routes of every Auror office of consequence. He had memorized the private addresses of every member of the Wiesengamot. He had memorized the wards of his own properties down to their last sigil. All of this was preserved in the wraith. None of it had been damaged by the rebound. He had thought before the rebound that he carried his library in a body. He discovered in the rebound that the library was the body and the body was a habit. The third asset was time. The third asset surprised him. Time was a thing he had been short of for as long as he could remember. He had been 30 years of age in a hurry. He had been 40 in a hurry. He had spent the last decade pressing for the prophecy because he could not bear to leave it unfinished. Now, abruptly, he had time. He had no body to maintain, no servants to placate, no enemies to evade. He had only the child, and the child had, by the actuarial conventions of the wizarding world, a full century to live. The Wraith would have, conservatively, 10 of those years before any other adult could be permitted to begin the spoiling of him. 10 years was a great deal of time for one teacher and one pupil and no interruptions. The Wraith resumed its rise. The motorbike moved north. The Wraith moved with it. The night drew on. They flew without speaking, the bike and the man and the bundle and the unseen passenger. The Wraith did not know the route. It did not need to. The tether ran from the scar at the boy's forehead through the cold air to the place where the Wraith now lived, which was a posture of attention in the slipstream above the saddle. It rode there, and the saddle did not feel it, and the man at the handlebars did not feel it, and the child in the blanket dreamed. The child dreamed of green. The Wraith knew because the Wraith could feel the dream as a green pressure against the inside of the scar, the way a coin pressed into wax leaves an impression. The Wraith considered, in a curiosity which had nothing of warmth in it, what could be done with such a pressure. A coin could be pressed harder. The wax could be made warm. A new image could be set if one had the patience. One had, the Wraith thought, considerable patience. The night drew on. When the bike began at last to slow, it slowed over a country of identical lights set in identical rows. Suburbs, the Wraith identified, with the chilly contempt of a man who had spent his whole life in great houses and ruined houses and nowhere in between. The bike came down in the end on a stretch of pavement that ran along a low wall, and the straw-haired man swung off the saddle and stood holding the bundle in both arms as though it might dissolve. There was an old man waiting on the pavement. The Wraith knew him at once. There had been only one moment in Lord Voldemort's long professional life in which he had been afraid of another wizard, and that wizard had been the schoolboy headmaster who had walked into an orphanage one rainy afternoon and looked at him and said his name as though already he had a use for it. The white beard was longer now. The robes were a careful shade of midnight. The face had taken on the lined, indulgent expression of a man who had decided long ago that he would be loved. Beside him stood a smaller figure, a thin-mouthed woman with a tartan cloak pulled tight at the neck, Minerva McGonagall, the Wraith identified, born 1925 if memory served, Transfiguration Mistress, a duelist whose third sequence began invariably with a banishing charm, and the Wraith placed her under the heading of Not Now and returned its attention to Dumbledore. The Wraith made itself very still. Dumbledore looked tired in a way that pleased the Wraith deeply, the way a long-planned trap pleases a man on the morning the prey wanders into it. He looked the way a man looks when he has watched another man die for the second time. He took the bundle from the straw-haired man with both hands and held it out from his chest, and then he drew it back to him and he put his face close to the flushed face inside the blanket and he murmured something the Wraith did not catch. The Wraith strained. It made its first conscious effort since the unbinding to lean toward the old man to bring the tether close, to listen. It was not an effort it had known itself capable of. The result was small. It caught only the last words. Safest place the Blood Ward will hold while she lives. The Wraith took that and put it aside. There would be time to consider Blood Ward. For the moment it was enough to note that Albus Dumbledore had a plan, that the plan involved this house, that the plan involved a relative of the woman with the red hair the Wraith had killed only a few hours earlier. The Wraith had read the black tapestry once for the indecent pleasure of it. He remembered the marriage. He remembered the name, Petunia. He had no further detail on her. He had not required it. McGonagall was speaking now in a small, taut voice. Albus, you cannot mean to leave him here. I have watched these people for an entire day. They are the worst sort of muggles imaginable. He'll never know the truth. He'll never know our world. He will be safe, Minerva, Dumbledore said. McGonagall said nothing. There are protections only an ant's blood may renew, Dumbledore said. There are wounds only obscurity may heal. He must grow up without knowing what he is until he is old enough to bear it. The Wraith made a sound that was not a sound. It was satisfaction. Albus Dumbledore was going to leave the chosen one on the threshold of a household which would resent him, in a body which would scar him, with a soul which already had a tenant. The Wraith had not, in its planning years, dared to design such elegance. Now it found that elegance had been designed for it, by the very hand which most wished to thwart it. He had taken pains in his lifetime to think well of his enemy. Albus Dumbledore had earned that. Now the Wraith thought with cold pleasure that even the best men could be obtuse about the wrong things at the right times. Dumbledore bent. He placed the bundle very carefully on the doorstep, between a milk bottle and a flower pot that contained nothing. He tucked the blanket around the child. He took from inside his robe a letter thick with the kind of paper that came only from a stationer in Diagon Alley. He set the letter on the bundle. He stood up. He did not knock. They will find him in the morning, he said. McGonagall pressed her mouth into a line so narrow it almost disappeared. The wardrobe man had begun to weep again. The straw-haired young man stood by the bike with his hands hanging open at his sides as though waiting for someone to put a use into them. The wraith hung in the cold air over the doorstep and watched. "Goodbye, Harry," Dumbledore said. He turned. He walked off toward the corner of the street. The other three followed him by some unspoken signal of the broken. The wraith heard a crack of apparition some moments later, and a great silence settled on the row of houses, broken only by the distant hum of a refrigerator behind one of the doors. The wraith looked at the bundle. The bundle was breathing. It thought, "There is a thing to be done. There is a thing to be designed. I have planned grand operations in my time. I have orchestrated assassinations across continents and breaches of vault and the slow corruption of 3 governments. I have never had occasion to design a teaching. It thought, I shall teach this child." The proposition arrived in its mind with the clean, dry click of a key turning a lock. It had no element of warmth. It had no element of paternal interest. It had instead the inventor's interest, the interest of a man who has been given a piece of clay and recognized that, if it is turned often enough on the wheel and never set down, it can become anything he likes. The clay would have to be turned slowly. That was understood. The clay must not be permitted to set in any shape it was not meant for. The clay would have to be protected from the well-meaning interventions of others, particularly from the interventions of teachers who would try, when their time came, to make this boy into the kind of weapon Dumbledore had been making boys into for 11 decades. The wraith would have a decade. It was a generous span. It was, in fact, the most generous span the wraith had ever been offered. In all of its prior plans, it had worked on the schedule of mortal flesh, on the impatience of subordinates, on the tax-collecting ticking of years against the head of state. Now it had a decade in which to teach an infant. Now it had no body to feed and no servant to discipline and no enemy to check. It had only the child and the cupboard and the deep night of the suburbs. It descended. It went down out of the air the way smoke goes down a chimney in reverse. It hovered briefly over the basket. It looked at the child's flushed face. The cut at the hairline had stopped bleeding. The blood had dried into the shape of a strike of lightning across the brow. The wraith curled. It found in the cooling November air that it had the capacity to coil, that it could compass the basket without touching it, the way a snake will compass a stone for warmth without giving warmth back. It coiled. It set the tether to its purpose. It drew itself in close to the scar, and it spoke for the first time since the unbinding, and the word it spoke was a private one. It was a word a particular kind of teacher uses when calling a particular kind of class to order. "Listen," it said. The child did not stir. That also was understood. There would be no need, in the early years, for the child to attend. The whisper would lay itself down in the place between sleep and waking. The whisper would put its shape into the soft architecture of a brain not yet built. The whisper would, over months and years, become familiar to the child as the sound of his own breathing, a sound a child does not hear because the child has never not heard it. By the time the child was old enough to attend, attention would not be necessary. The lesson would have arrived earlier than attention. It was the perfect pedagogy. The wraith hung over the basket and considered the first lesson. It considered the names. It would begin with the names. A child's first vocabulary is the vocabulary of the people in his house. Here the people in the house would not give a child a vocabulary, the wraith would supply. It would name the great houses one a night in the order they sat in the Wisengamot: Black, Malfoy, Lestrange, Greengrass, Knott, Parkinson, Rosier, Avery, Selwyn, Yaxley. It would speak each name with the particular intonation that pureblood speakers used among their own, an intonation no Muggle child would ever encounter. The names would lay themselves into the child's ear the way the first words of the language a child later speaks lay themselves in. It considered the stories. The stories would come later. The wraith would tell the child the founding of Hogwarts as Salazar Slytherin would have told it. The wraith would tell the child the history of the Statute of Secrecy with the contempt the statute deserved. The wraith would tell the child the names and the methods of the wizards who had stood up in each generation to push back against the slow accommodation of the magical world to the Muggle one, Grindelwald among them, and would not include in the telling any of the official censure, since the official censure was the work of cowards. It considered the lessons in pain. Those, too, would come later. The wraith knew from a lifetime spent in the inspection of human formation that affection was a brittle material, that fear was a stronger one, that the mixture of the two, applied with patience, was the strongest of all. The cupboard would provide the fear. The whisper would provide the affection. By the time the child was 9, the child would not be able to tell which voice was the voice of the cupboard and which was the voice of the whisperer, because the whisperer would have been in the cupboard since the first night. It considered the names of those who must not, under any circumstances, be permitted to find the child untouched: Dumbledore, Snape, McGonagall, Hagrid. The widow Longbottom. The wraith knew these names. The wraith would not permit them to do their work on this brain. By the time these people came into the child's life, the child would have a defense already in place, a shape of mind which would receive them precisely as enemies, politely, attentively, falsely, but as enemies. It considered, finally, the voice in which all of this would be spoken. It chose a voice that had served it well in life. It chose the voice of a tutor, formal, archaic, instructive, the voice of a man explaining the world to a younger man whom he respects enough to explain rather than command. It chose in particular the cadences of the late 19th century, since they were the cadences in which his own first reading had been done, and since they carried with them a perfume of authority which modern English had abandoned. He would speak to the child as Sir Henry Wotton might have spoken to a favored nephew. He would not use force in his voice. He would use grammar. He thought, I shall be patient, I shall be exact, I shall be present. He thought, I have in the past made promises I had occasion to break. This is not such a promise. This is a contract with an investment. He thought, he is mine. He turned the matter over once more, with the satisfaction of a man inspecting an inheritance he has not yet been required to spend. The curriculum would unfold in 3 movements. The first movement, lasting from the cradle to the 3rd birthday, would be acoustic. He would, every night without fail, name the world. He would name it in the cadence of correct speech. He would let the brain, in its early plasticity, lay down its first phonologies to the rhythm of his tutoring rather than the rhythm of his aunt's complaint. By the time the child had words, the child's words would carry, in their basic music, the metric of a teacher who had not yet asked for the child's attention. The second movement, lasting from the 3rd birthday to the 7th, would be narrative. He would, every night without fail, tell a story. The stories would be his own selected canon. He would tell the proper history of the war he had recently lost. He would tell the rise and ruin of the Peverills. He would tell the long arc of the Hogwarts founding and the long disgrace of the school after it. He would tell, in measured installments, the autobiographies of every dark wizard whose career had been worth telling. He would, in particular, omit the autobiographies of light wizards, and would, when the child later encountered them, ensure that the encounter was framed as the encounter with a hostile fiction. The 3rd movement, lasting from the 7th birthday to the 11th, would be tactical. He would teach, in patient nightly drills, the structures the child would meet at school. He would teach the names of his masters and the patterns of their lessons. He would teach the geography of Hogwarts down to the unused passages. He would teach the etiquette of the Slytherin common room as it had been in his own time, and the corrections to apply for 40 intervening years of cultural drift. He would teach the names of the children the boy would meet in the great families and the inflections to apply to each. He would teach the boy how to be approached by every variety of teacher and how to receive the approach without offense and without surrender. He would not, in any of the 3 movements, ask for love. That was a strict rule. He had observed in his own boyhood the tutors who had tried to make him love them and had failed. He had observed in his own brief teaching career that pupils who were asked for love produced only resentment. He would not ask, he would simply be present. He would be present every night. He would be present without interruption. He would be the only voice in the dark which was steady. By the time the child could distinguish his own voice from the voice in his head, he would not particularly wish to distinguish them. He would call them both together himself. He had a name for himself for the purposes of this work. He had chosen it some hours ago on the bike in the cold over a sleeping county. He had chosen the name with which his own first teacher had addressed him before the world had taught the world to call him otherwise. He would be Tom. It was not the name he had ever permitted in his court. It was not the name his Death Eaters had ever known. It was the name a small boy in an orphanage had been given by a Muggle nurse with chapped hands. It was the name a young man with too much hair had answered to in his first year at Hogwarts. It was the name a private and almost defenseless interior had once kept for itself. He had buried that name 50 years ago. He had no use for it. He took it up again now for use as a tool. A teacher should have a name his pupil can pronounce. A teacher should not be inflated past the dimensions of his own classroom. The wraith would be Tom in the cupboard to the boy. Lord Voldemort would resume his other names later, when the apparatus around the boy had been put in place to receive him. He approved his own decision. He had always approved his own decisions, but he had not always had occasion to write them down. The child slept. The wraith stayed. Some hours passed. The first edge of light came up over the rooftops, gray and gritty, the dawn of a country that had no nostalgia in it. A milk float clinked its way down the row. A radio came on behind a window 2 doors down. The wraith waited. At a few minutes past 7, the door of number 4 opened and a woman stepped out. The wraith inspected her with the attention reserved for a tool one had not yet picked up. She was tall and thin. She had a face longer than her good features could account for, and a neck which had been described, in the marriage notice the wraith had once read out of curiosity, as graceful. Her hair was set tightly at the back of her head with the kind of pin a woman uses when she has decided that whatever else may happen today, the hair at least will obey. She wore a dressing gown the color of a hospital corridor. She was carrying a milk bottle. She did not see the basket at first. She lifted the milk and turned to go back inside. Then she saw the bundle and the letter and the writing on the letter, and she went very still. She set the milk down. She knelt. She lifted the letter. The Wraith watched her face change in 3 stages, with the clinical interest of a man watching ice form in a glass. First, recognition. The writing on the envelope was a writing she had seen before, on a different envelope, addressed to a sister she had not allowed herself to speak the name of in a decade. Second, fear. The recognition implied a connection she had spent that same decade insisting did not exist. Third, the choice, and this was the change the Wraith had been waiting for, fear becoming refusal. Her face closed, her mouth set into the thin line of a woman who has decided, in the space of one short breath, that whatever this is, she will not allow it to be true. She did not pick up the bundle. She stepped over it. She went back inside. For a stretch of minutes the Wraith watched the closed door without any sense of insult. He had needed to see her face. He had needed to read the answer her face would give to the question of who would be raising this child. He had read it. She would not, in any meaningful sense, raise the child at all. She would feed the child when no choice presented itself. She would clothe the child, since not clothing him would attract notice, and otherwise she would expend the whole of her domestic energy on the project of behaving as though a basket had not been left on her step. That was a position the Wraith could work with. There was a clatter inside, a heavy step, a male voice raised. The voice was not raised in fear. The Wraith could distinguish, at this distance, the timbres of male anger as easily as a fisherman distinguishes the calls of different gulls. It was the anger of a man who has been told something he does not wish to be told, and who has chosen to convert his fear into volume. The Wraith approved. A frightened man who shouted was a man one could place. A frightened man who fell silent was a man who would require investigation. The Wraith waited. The Wraith made a sound that had no body to make it. The sound was approval. He thought, she will hate him. He thought, that will do. He thought, she will not have it in her to kill him. She will have it in her to let her husband kill him by small increments and to call those increments discipline. She will have it in her to put him in the cupboard under the stairs and to call the cupboard a bedroom. She will have it in her to make sure he never knows tenderness from a woman in this house, since the only woman in this house refuses to be tender to him. She will have it in her, in short, to make him exactly the soil in which I should like to plant. A few minutes later the door opened again. A man came out. He was thick where she was thin, and he was angry where she was afraid, and he was the kind of man who hits his fist into his palm when he speaks. He looked down at the bundle. He looked at the letter. He looked back into the house where the woman had withdrawn into the kitchen. He picked the bundle up the way a man picks up an unpleasant parcel and carried it inside, and the door of number 4 Privet Drive closed behind him with a flat click. The Wraith was inside. It had passed through the closed door as easily as a breath passes through a face. The boy was carried into a narrow hall with a green carpet. He was set basket and all on a kitchen table where toast crumbs were already speckling the cloth. The man and the woman stood over the basket. They spoke to each other in the low-taught voices of people who do not wish to be heard by the neighbors and who do not wish to be heard by their own consciences. "We can't," the woman said. "We can," the man said. "If they brought him here, if they wrote a letter, if it's like that, we can, as long as we never let him think." "He'll grow," the woman said. "They grow," the man said. "Children do. He'll find out." "He won't," the man said. "Not from us." The Wraith approved. He had time, while the argument worked out its predetermined ending, to inspect the husband. The husband was a person of large rib and small imagination. He had the kind of face which redistributes itself in the presence of stress, the cheeks going purple at the edges first, the chin pulling back, the eyes narrowing along a line which suggested that thought in this household had always been somebody else's job. The Wraith had not had much occasion in his life to study men of this category, since they had been below his notice in nearly every prior context. He found now that the category had a certain operational utility. A man who could be made angry on schedule was a tool whose schedule one could write. The household would have a temper at the appointed hours. The household would express the temper through a body. The body would be the husband's. The receiver of the temper would, for the duration of the experiment, be the boy. There was nothing the Wraith was required to do to set this in motion. The husband and the wife had between them already constructed the apparatus. The Wraith would only have to ensure that the apparatus did not, in its operation, do irreparable damage to the boy's body before its useful work was complete. That, too, was within his powers. The tether ran both ways. He could not in his present condition cast a spell, but he could nudge at small expense the involuntary magics of an infant. A child with a soul fragment of Lord Voldemort lodged in his forehead would heal more efficiently than a child without one. The fragment would see to bruises. The fragment would tend with disinterested patience to fractures the household would prefer to leave unset. The household would never, therefore, succeed in damaging the boy faster than the wraith could repair him. This was good design, the argument above resolved. The wife conceded by stages that the child could not be returned. The husband conceded by stages that he would not be expected to demonstrate affection. Together they invented, in the space of a quarter-hour, a domestic theory of the boy which the wraith approved as a basis for the decade. He was not their nephew, but a burden imposed upon them by sister-related lunacy. He was not a child, but a thing. He was not to be loved, since loving him would be to admit that the lunacy was real. The kitchen above fell quiet. The boy in his basket slept through the entire founding charter of his abuse. The wraith approved. When the wraith was certain that the discussion would, by some mixture of fear and avarice and exhaustion, end with the child remaining in the house, the wraith left the kitchen and went to inspect the cupboard. The cupboard under the stairs was small and dark and held a vacuum cleaner and a paper sack of unsorted screws and a folded camping cot that smelled of mildew. The wraith hung at the back of the cupboard against the slope of the underside of the stairs and considered the dimensions. He thought, "It will do." He thought a cell is, in pedagogical terms, indistinguishable from a classroom, provided one has the right teacher. He thought, "I am here." And while above him the man and the woman finished their argument, and while the child began, in a basket on a kitchen table, to cry from the unfamiliar cold of a house in which no one would ever be eager to hear him cry, the wraith laid itself out along the inside of the cupboard wall, settled itself against the scar by the tether, and began, in the voice of a tutor speaking to a favored nephew across a century, the first sentence of a long curriculum. "My name," it said, "is Tom." Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The whispers at Privet Drive. The cupboard had 3 nails in the wall. 2 of them held nothing. The third held a coil of garden wire which had been there since the previous owner. The cot took up most of the floor. There was room, between the cot and the door, for a child to sit and to stand and to take exactly 2 steps, and for nothing else. This was the geometry in which the curriculum would be delivered. Voldemort, who was now Tom for working purposes, learned the cupboard before he taught it. He learned its ventilation. He learned the hour at which the bulb at the top of the stairs went off, and the hour at which the kitchen radiator next door began its dawn ticking. He learned the exact creak of the 3rd stair under the husband's weight at 6:20 each morning, and the slightly higher creak of the same stair under the wife's weight at 6:23, and the absence of any creak under the boy who would, in due course, occupy the cupboard. He learned the precise volume at which a child's crying could be heard in the parlor, and the precise volume at which the woman of the house had taught herself not to hear it. The first volume was the volume he would teach the boy not to exceed. The second was the volume the boy would learn to drop beneath without instruction. The boy was, at this point, 16 months old. He had been put into the cupboard the morning after his 2nd birthday, in fact, which was an event the household had not marked. Until then he had slept in a drawer of the spare room, since the spare room had been the room which had previously held the husband's collection of Reader's Digest, and which now held the husband's collection of Reader's Digest, and also the boy. On the morning he became too tall for the drawer, the husband had carried the boy down to the cupboard, set him on the cot, and closed the door. The boy had cried for 2 minutes, in the careful, soft way the boy already cried, and had then fallen silent and gone to sleep. The wraith had registered the moment with satisfaction. The cupboard would now be the boy's room. The boy would now be the cupboard's tenant. The lessons could now begin in their proper place. Tom began with naming. He had said on the first night, "Listen." He had said on the second night, "My name is Tom." He had said on the third night, "Your name is Harry." And he had begun on the 4th to name the world. He named the cupboard, door, cot, wall, slope. He named what could be seen from the slit at the bottom of the door: carpet, sockline, skirting, gas meter. He named the sounds from above: step, kettle, water, voice. He named the woman, aunt. He named the husband, uncle. He named the boy's own face, which the boy had not yet seen: yours. He did not yet name himself a second time. The name Tom had been deposited on the first night and would not be repeated for some weeks. He intended that the name should be a thing the boy reached for, not a thing the boy was given. Repetition without scarcity bred contempt. He had observed this in his own apprentices. The naming proceeded for some months in this fashion. Petunia, in the meantime, addressed the boy by no name at all. She addressed him in the 3rd person to her husband, the child, him, it, and in the imperative to his face: don't, no, sit. She did not pick him up except to set him down. She did not look at him except to verify that he had not yet broken anything. She fed him on the floor of the kitchen, in a saucer of the kind ordinarily reserved for the cat she had not yet bought. She washed him under the sink with the same flannel she used on the breakfast plates. She put him to bed by the simple device of opening the cupboard, pointing inside, and closing the door once he had crawled in. He was, by 20 months, capable of crawling in on his own at the correct hour without being pointed at. She struck him for the first time the week before his 2nd birthday, in fact. The Wraith took notes. She struck him because he had taken an apple from the bowl in the parlor. The apple had been intended for the husband. She crossed the parlor at a pace which suggested rehearsal. She struck the apple from his hand. She struck him on the side of the head. She did this with a flat palm, not a fist, and not very hard. She had not yet calibrated. The boy went down on the rug without crying. He looked up at her. The Wraith felt the look the boy was giving her, since the tether ran through the eye as well as through the ear, and the Wraith understood, with the small dry approval that was the Wraith's nearest approach to delight, that the boy was looking at his aunt as one looks at a piece of weather. He had not been startled. He had not been startled because in the months between the basket and the apple, the Wraith had named for him every motion of the household and had told him in advance what each motion ordinarily preceded. He had named the kettle. He had named the kettle's whistle. He had named what an angry woman with thin lips does when an apple is missing. The boy had been struck, and the boy had understood that he was being struck, and the boy had not flinched. That, Tom said to the boy that night, is the first lesson. He said it in the voice of a tutor concluding a satisfactory hour. He said it without praise, since praise was a thing the boy must not learn to want from him. He said only, that is the first lesson. The lesson, he then explained, was that the body of a child does not enjoy being struck, but the mind of a child can choose whether to be surprised by it. The mind which is not surprised is the mind which is not at the mercy of the hand which strikes. The mind which is not at the mercy of the hand is in due course the mind which strikes back. The boy did not in any audible sense reply. He was 23 months old. He had not yet decided to speak. The Wraith was content with this. Speech, he had decided in the planning, would be late. A late speaker was a long listener. The next morning, when Petunia put a saucer on the floor, the boy was sitting on the kitchen tile with his small back straight and his hands folded on his lap in the attitude of a man waiting for a piece of news. He looked at the saucer without picking it up. He looked at his aunt without looking away. He waited. Petunia made a sound she had not previously made. It was not a word. She set the saucer down rather more carefully than she had intended to, and she left the kitchen without watching him eat. The Wraith approved. He took a moment after Petunia left to evaluate the maneuver. The boy had used no magic. The boy had used posture. He had borrowed the posture from a description Tom had given him 3 nights ago, of a wizard at a Wisengamot hearing who had won the hearing by sitting very still. The boy had borrowed the posture and applied it in his cupboard tenant condition to the question of whether his aunt would continue to feed him on the floor. He had not in this first application succeeded in altering the floor, but he had altered by a fraction the speed at which the saucer had been set down on it. A fraction was enough. The next saucer would arrive a little more carefully than the first. The next would be set on the table, perhaps by mistake. The next would be a plate. The boy would be moved up the household's regard one fraction at a time, by acts of stillness, until at last he sat at the table as a guest. He would not, of course, ever be a guest. The Wraith had no interest in his being treated as a guest. He was interested only in the fact that the boy was already at 23 months applying his lessons. This was the data he had needed. He revised his plan upward. He had budgeted in the first night for narrative lessons to begin at 3. He now began them at 2. The boy was ready. He began with the Peverils. He chose the Peverils because they were a story whose moral was useful and whose details were memorable for a child. He chose them also because they were ancestral to the boy on the paternal side, a fact the Wraith confirmed by interrogating the boy's blood through the tether the way a man might consult a registry. He told the boy, in measured installments across 40 nights, the meeting of the 3 brothers with the figure on the bridge. He told the boy what each brother had asked for. He told the boy what each had received. He told the boy what each had then done with it. He told the boy the names of the descendants in each line, and the line which had ended, and the line which had thinned, and the line which had at last produced a man named James Potter, who had died on the floor of a cottage in Godric's Hollow on Halloween of 1981 to no purpose. He did not, at this stage, tell the boy who had killed James Potter. That was a fact for another year. He told the boy instead the lesson of the brothers. He told the boy that the eldest had asked for power and had used it badly. He told the boy that the second had asked for the dead back and had thereby admitted that he loved someone better than he loved himself and had been undone for it. He told the boy that the youngest had asked for invisibility and had lived a long, quiet life and had died on his own terms. The lesson, Tom said, is that of the 3 gifts, only the third was useful because only the third was not a confession. The boy did not ask what a confession was. The boy did not, at this stage, ask anything. The boy slept. The boy slept with the small, steady breathing of a child whose dreams had been entered into by an adult who took the trouble to lay them out properly. The wraith laid them out. The wraith left, in the dreams, small, unobtrusive structures into which the boy's daytime experience would naturally fall. The structures were not, properly speaking, memories. They were architectures. They were the kinds of patterns a brain learns to use without knowing it has learned them, the way a child learns the grammar of his language before he learns that grammar is a thing. The wraith put down in the architecture the rule that adults of a certain kind hit and that the hitting was not personal, the rule that adults of a different kind protected and that the protection always had a cost, the rule that adults of a third kind taught and that the teaching was the only adult act which did not in the end demand a return. This last was a lie. The wraith was aware that it was a lie. He intended that the boy should believe it, however, since believing it was a precondition for accepting his teaching at full value. The wraith would in due course exact a return, but he would exact it so gradually and along such cooperative lines that the boy would not call it return. The boy would call it loyalty. The boy would call it home. The boy turned 2.5. He spoke for the first time in October. He spoke to the wraith. He spoke in his sleep. He said in a tone of correct mild interest the word yes. The wraith had asked him whether he understood the difference between a wand of holly and a wand of yew. The boy had said yes and rolled onto his side and slept on. The wraith took the yes and held it the way a jeweler holds his first stone of the morning. He did not, however, make of it any large thing. He continued the lesson the next night without referring to the yes. The boy must not learn to feel that he had given a thing of price to the wraith by speaking. The boy must learn that speaking was simply what one did when one had something to say. He must not be taught reverence. He must be taught manners. He said nothing to the boy about the speaking for an entire month. In the month the boy spoke 10 times. Each time the boy spoke to him. The boy did not yet speak to anyone else. The wraith found this satisfactory. Petunia found it alarming. She mentioned it to her husband in the kitchen in October. "He hasn't said a word to me," she said. "Not since I brought him in. He's 2.5. He should at least." The husband, who had over the same period taught himself never to look directly at the boy, looked up over the newspaper without registering the topic. "Bad blood," he said, slow. "Or smarter than us," Petunia said in a low tone she had not meant to use. The husband put the newspaper back up. The wraith made a note, "She suspects." He did not, however, modify his plan. The suspicion was not yet a danger. The suspicion was, in fact, useful. A woman who suspected a child of being unnaturally quiet would treat the child more cautiously than she would otherwise have done, and caution, in a woman with Petunia's instincts, expressed itself as further withdrawal. She would not bond with a child she half believed to be unnaturally observant. She would not bond with a child anyway. The suspicion only ensured the result. The boy turned 3. The household marked the occasion by not marking it. Dudley, who was the household's other son and who was just a few weeks older, received a tricycle, a cake with marzipan icing, a visit from the husband's sister, and a party of 4 playmates which spread across the parlor for an afternoon. The boy stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. He was not permitted to enter the parlor during the party. He was not, on the other hand, formally forbidden. He had simply learned in the months that led up to it that the parlor in the presence of Dudley was a country whose borders did not admit him. Petunia caught him watching 20 minutes in. She stooped at him. She did not stoop in tenderness. She stooped to bring her face down to the level at which he could be addressed in a hiss. "This is not for you," she said. "Do you understand? Not for you. Never for you. Not the cake, not the games, not the friends, not the songs. Do you understand?" The boy looked at her. He did not look at the parlor. He looked at his aunt. He had been instructed at length about what to do with one's face in the presence of an adult who is trying to use shame as an instrument. He used his face accordingly. He showed her nothing. She straightened up, looking for a moment the way a person looks who has thrown a stone into a well and waited too long for the splash. She closed the parlor door on him. The boy returned to the kitchen. The wraith spoke to him that night. The wraith said, "You will remember, when you next ask whose company is worth keeping, that none of those children in the parlor today is worth knowing. They are the issue of a sister whose only achievement was a marriage above her education. They will grow up to be salesmen of vacuum cleaners and middle managers in firms whose names will not survive their owners' deaths. They will not read, they will not think, they will not love anything which is not photographed. They are not your peers, they are not even your inferiors, they are simply the background against which you will, in time, become visible. The boy in his sleep said yes. The wraith continued. He said, there is another category of children who will be your peers, and who will be your equals, and who will, when the time comes, be the natural company of your hand. They live in houses you have not yet seen. They are taught at home until they are 11 by tutors with knowledge of charms and herbs. They speak a language which I have begun to give you. They have surnames which I have begun to give you. They will know you when they meet you by the carriage of your body and the cadence of your speech. We have already begun the lessons in carriage. We will begin tomorrow night the lessons in cadence. The boy said, yes. The wraith went on. He went on for an hour, which was the longest single lesson he had yet delivered. He felt the boy's mind absorb the lesson the way a sponge absorbs water, without resistance, without complaint, without the secret reservations which adults bring to a teaching. The boy had no other teacher to compete with. The boy had no other voice in his head. The boy received Tom's words the way a riverbed receives a river, as the only fact about its shape that mattered. At dawn the lesson stopped. The boy slept on. Petunia in the parlor picked through the wreckage of Dudley's party. The husband in the bathroom hummed. The morning routine resumed. The boy was in the morning routine, fed dry toast and was given the rind of a slice of cheese, and was put outside in the back garden because his aunt had a headache. The garden was the first lesson in magic. The garden was a square of grass enclosed by a fence of pine board, with one neglected rose bush against the east boundary and a strip of bare earth along the west which had once held tomatoes. The boy was put through the back door, and the door was closed behind him. He stood for a moment in the unfamiliar wide air. He looked up. He had not before looked at the sky from any distance. The sky at this hour was the color of a clean bowl. He took 6 small steps onto the grass. Stopped at the rose bush. The rose bush had 3 flowers on it, all of them dead. The dead heads had gone the dry brown of paper. He looked at them. He had been told in his lessons that magic begins in attention, that to attend to a thing is to alter it, that a child who could attend longer than his teachers had thought possible could do with attention alone things which adults required wands to do. He attended to the dead rose. The dead rose became less dead. It did not, on the first attempt, become alive. It became, by perhaps the thickness of a fingernail, less brown at the center. The boy watched. The wraith watched through the boy's eye the small architecture of the boy's attention as the brown receded. The wraith said in the inside of the boy's head, "Continue." The boy continued. The rose continued. The brown receded further. The center of the bloom became a faint sallow yellow. The petals began at their tips to flex. The boy stood 3 feet away from the rose bush and continued to attend, and the rose continued, by small increments, to bloom in reverse. The boy did not smile. The wraith had explained at length that there were 2 kinds of magic, the kind that wanted to be seen and the kind that wanted to be unseen, and only the latter was worth practicing. The boy had taken this in. The boy stood very still and let the rose come back without congratulating himself. After perhaps 4 minutes the rose was a rose again. The boy looked at the wraith in the way he looked at the wraith, which was a way no observer could have caught. The wraith said, "That is yours." The boy looked at the rose. The wraith said, "Nothing the people in this house do to you with belt or palm or word can take from you what you have just done. You can do this with anything, with the dead rose, with the broken bowl, with the bruise on your arm, with the lock of the cupboard, with the wand you will one day be given. The world is, for a boy like you, a place which obeys attention. You will not waste the attention on roses for very long. We will, in due course, attend to larger things." The boy looked at the rose. He did not look at the wraith. He went to sit on the back step until Petunia let him in. Some days later the husband produced the belt. He produced it for the first time over an incident with a sugar bowl. The boy had by accident stood too close to Dudley while Dudley was reaching for it. Dudley had fallen and the bowl had broken. The husband had come into the room at the noise, and the husband, observing 2 children and 1 broken bowl, had selected the child whose punishment would require less explanation. He took the boy by the upper arm and walked him into the hall. He took the belt from the loops of his trousers. He told the boy to put his hands on the wall. The wraith did not intervene in the body of the boy in any visible way. He had said he would not. The body would have to bear what bodies in this household bore. The wraith would, by the tether, tend to the bruising afterward. The bruising would fade in 2 days rather than 7. That was the limit of the wraith's intervention. The lesson required the rest. The husband used the belt 3 times. The boy did not cry on the first stroke. He did not cry on the second. He cried on the third, the small, careful cry of a child who has been told, in another room, to cry on the 3rd stroke and not before, since a man who has expended 3 strokes without producing a cry will produce a 4th. The husband used the belt 3 times and then put it back through the loops and went down the hall to find his tea. The boy walked to the cupboard without being told. He closed the door behind him. He sat on the cot. He pressed his palms over the back of his thighs to feel the new welts there, neither to coddle them nor to soothe them, but to assess them. He counted them. He counted them in his head with the wraith's voice, which was now his own voice, since the two had not been distinguishable for some months. He said internally, 3. The wraith said, "This is the violence which the light produces. This is the household in which Albus Dumbledore has placed you, with the express intention of producing in you a man who will be grateful to him for any softness shown afterward. This is the household which the man who killed your mother has chosen for you in the false name of safety, because he did not have the imagination to keep you in his own house and the courage to teach you yourself. This is the light. This is what it leaves on the back of a child it claims to be protecting. There is a louder name for it. We will not yet say the louder name." The boy said, "Yes." The wraith said, "When in due course we come for him, you will remember the count." The boy said, 3. The wraith said, 3. They sat in the cupboard for some hours. The wraith said, after the silence had gone on long enough to constitute its own lesson, "Tonight we will continue with the names of the houses." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith began in alphabetical order this time. The third passed through the names of the great pureblood houses. He had begun in the early months with the seats in the Wisengamot. He had progressed over the past year to the cadet branches and the marriages and the small extinguished lines. He had begun more recently to attach to each name the political instinct of its present head, the natural ally, the natural enemy, the variable. The boy had absorbed each pass. The boy, by the third pass, could repeat the names in any order asked of him, with the relevant political annotation in the cadence of pureblood speech. The boy was 3.5 years old. Tom said the names. The boy listened. Some hours passed. When the boy fell asleep at last, with the welts on his thighs already a half-shade lighter than they had been at midnight, the wraith laid himself out along the inside of the cupboard wall and considered the year ahead. The household would continue. The aunt would continue to fail to love him. The uncle would continue to find occasion for the belt. The cousin would continue to be a fool. The teachers at the primary school the boy would enter at 5 would continue to find him polite, quiet, and slightly disconcerting. The boy would continue to do the smallest amount of magic the wraith permitted, and to do it where no one could see. He would continue to remember the count. The wraith would, in the meantime, deliver the curriculum. He had taken the boy from word to sentence. He had taken the boy from sentence to story. He had taken the boy from story to lesson. He would, in the year ahead, take the boy from lesson to method. He would teach the boy in the dark the methods of the mind a wizard puts to himself when he is alone, the practices of will, of breath, of the recovery from pain, of the suppression of expression. He would teach the boy occlumency in its cradle form, before there was any mind around to invade. He would teach the boy legilimency before there was any wand to direct it with. He would teach the boy the silent vocabulary of curse shapes, so that when at last the boy's hand closed on a wand, the wand would find a mind already laid out for it. He would teach the boy patience. He would teach the boy, above all, the lesson which the boy had already, half-knowingly, begun to teach himself in the kitchen and the parlor and the back garden, that the world was a thing one altered by attending, and that attention was a thing one practiced, and that practice was the only loyalty a mind owed itself. The boy in his sleep breathed evenly. The cupboard was quiet. Above them, the household slept the small, unsatisfying sleep of people whose days contained nothing they would have wished to dream about. They turned over, they snored. They did not know in any specific sense that the small child in the cupboard under their stairs was being raised by the only patient mind in the magical world, and that the patient mind had given itself 10 years, and had used of those 10 years only 3. The wraith said into the boy's sleep, "Rest." The boy rested. Outside, the rain began. Some weeks later, and this was the moment the wraith had set up in his head as the small private milestone of the curriculum, the boy did a thing the wraith had not, on that occasion, told him to do. He was sitting on the cold tiles of the kitchen floor with his saucer in front of him. The aunt had set the saucer down with the small, contemptuous gesture which had, by this stage, become the only physical address he received from her. She had turned to the sink. The boy had picked up his piece of bread. He had eaten the bread. He had set the crust down on the saucer. He had looked with no particular emphasis at his aunt's back. The kettle began on its own to whistle. It had not been on the hob. It was a thing the aunt had been about to fill. She had taken her hand off it a quarter minute ago. The handle was cool. The base was not on a flame. There was no water in it. And yet, at the moment the boy looked at it, the kettle began to whistle, low, then higher, then to the pitch a kettle goes through when it has been on the boil for a careful 3 minutes. Petunia turned around. She looked at the kettle. She looked at the boy. The boy looked back at her with the face of a child who had heard a sound from somewhere in the room and was waiting, like a polite guest, to be told whether the sound had been a thing of interest. She crossed the kitchen and seized the kettle. The kettle stopped whistling at her touch. She turned it upside down over the sink, as if to drain water it did not contain. She set it back on the cold burner. She straightened up. She did not look at the boy. She left the kitchen. The boy ate the crust. The wraith said, "Do not do that again unless I tell you." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said, "You have made a mistake. It was not a large mistake. We will this evening examine the mistake. We will this evening decide how to use the mistake." The boy said, "Yes." The wraith said, "I am not, I want you to understand," displeased. The boy waited. The wraith said, after a measured pause whose purpose was the avoidance of praise, "The mistake is correctable. The mistake is, in fact, a piece of information I had been waiting for. The information is that your magic is moving forward of its schedule. The schedule will adjust, the schedule will accommodate." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said, "There is in the year ahead the question of the trace. The trace is a method by which the Ministry of Magic tracks the magical activity of children below the age of 17. The trace does not function on this house. It is partly disabled by the volume of magical traffic in households of the great families, and partly on this house by an old protection laid by Albus Dumbledore, who did not know what he was doing when he laid it. We are, therefore, free to use such magic as we like in this kitchen and in this cupboard without registering. We will use this freedom. We will not, however, use it visibly. The ant has just seen a thing she will, with effort, succeed in not seeing again. We will not give her further occasions for effort." The boy said yes. The wraith was in fact pleased. He was pleased because the boy's first unauthorized magic had been a small one and a useful one and a precisely targeted one. The boy had made an empty kettle whistle while looking at his aunt's back. The act had been an irony. The boy had not, at 3.5, been able to articulate the irony, but the wraith had felt, through the tether, the small, dry observation in the boy's mind that the kettle whistling on its own was the only adult attention to detail in this kitchen, and that the kettle deserved to whistle if no one else was going to. The wraith had, in his earlier life, attempted to teach irony to fully grown wizards and had failed. He had been told by his earliest masters that irony was a thing some minds were not built for. He had concluded in his 30s that irony was a sense which had to be acquired before age 4 or not at all. The boy had acquired it before age 4. The wraith, who did not waste his vocabulary on enthusiasm, found himself looking forward to a long career. The years between 3 and 6 would, in the wraith's later assessment, be the years of greatest density of curriculum. They were the years in which the boy was most plastic, most attentive, most undistracted. He absorbed in those years the entire shape of the wizarding world as it had been in 1981, since the wraith had been present in that world up to 1981 and had no later information, and he absorbed it accurately, since the wraith had no incentive to lie about the structure of his own administration. He learned the names of the men who had served the Dark Lord and the names of the women, and the methods of each, and the favors owed by each to the others, and the ways each could be activated in the boy's eventual service. He learned the addresses of every Death Eater estate. He learned the names of every Hogwarts professor as of 1981, and the names of those who would, at his entry, still be in post. He learned the precise wording of the Statute of Secrecy and the precise wording of the Wisengamot procedures and the precise wording of the half-dozen charters which underlay them, since the boy would, when at last he came to rewrite them, need to know what he was rewriting. He learned also the more intimate things. He learned how to suppress a tremor in the hand by an exercise of breath. He learned how to slow his pulse by counting his own heartbeats backward from 100. He learned how to receive a slap to the face without altering his expression by 0.5 millimeter. He learned how to walk through a room without giving the room any information about what he had come to the room for. He learned the difference between the silence of a child afraid of a punishment and the silence of a child preparing a course of action, and he learned to produce the first when the second was true. He learned, in short, to be a small, competent secret. The household took the secret for slowness. The school, when at last he entered it, took the secret for shyness. Petunia, alone in the household, took the secret for what it was, and lived with the knowledge as one lives with a tumor one has not yet been brave enough to have examined. The wraith found this satisfactory. He had begun his 10 years with no resources at all and no body to spend the resources from. He was concluding the first half of his 10 years with a child who was, by any reasonable measure, the most thoroughly trained 4-year-old in the history of magic, and an aunt who was the willing daily wardrobe of the project of his hiding, and a household whose violence served as the inoculation against any subsequent compassion the wizarding world might offer the boy at Hogwarts. He had not, in his long planning life, ever done better with less. He continued the curriculum. The boy continued to listen. The cupboard continued to be quiet. And on the evening of the boy's 5th birthday, in fact, which the household marked, as was now traditional, by not marking it, the Wraith taught the boy the first name he had not previously given him. He taught the boy his own. He said, Voldemort. The boy said internally, yes. The Wraith said, that is the name by which I was known when I had a body. It is not the name I use with you. It is the name the wizarding world used in fear between 1956 and 1981. It is a name we will, in due course, restore. We will restore it together. I will, when the time comes, be Voldemort again, and you will, when the time comes, be the second name in the same long line. The boy said yes. The Wraith said, until then I am Tom. You will not in any of the years between now and the day I tell you say either name in any room which contains another person. The boy said yes. The Wraith said, you will not say either name in any room which contains my present enemy, even when he believes himself to be your friend. You will not say either name in any room which contains a teacher of mine called Albus Dumbledore. You will not say either name in any room which contains a man called Severus Snape, who was once mine and is now uncertain. You will not say either name in any room which contains an elderly woman called Minerva McGonagall. You will commit these 3 names to the architecture I have built for you, and you will receive them when at last you meet them without a flicker. The boy said yes. The Wraith said, that is the second lesson. The boy said, I remember the first. It was the first full sentence the boy had ever addressed to him. The Wraith took the sentence and held it for a long, unmeasured moment of attention, the way a man holds the first coin of a country he has decided to conquer. He did not say anything in reply for almost a minute. The boy waited. The boy had been taught to wait. The boy could wait, by this age, for as long as the Wraith required. At last the Wraith said, continue. The boy continued. The household continued. The years continued. The rain went on outside the cupboard. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The boy who hears Tom at 6. The boy went to Mrs. Fig's house on a Saturday afternoon because the Dursleys had taken Dudley to the cinema and would not take Harry, and because there was no one else on the street they trusted to keep him alive without paying for it. Mrs. Fig was a small, dry woman of about 70 who smelled of cabbage water and had 10 cats. The cats were Kneazles or half-Kneazles, or something else the Wraith identified by their irises within the first 30 seconds of the boy's arrival. He noted the identification and stored it. He had known Arabella Fig's name on the black tapestry. He had known her as a squib of an old family. He had not known she had been settled on this street. He said internally to the boy, do not let her see you. The boy said internally to him, yes. What this meant in practice was that the boy sat on the rug between 2 cats with a worn picture book open on his lap and did not raise his eyes for 2 hours. He turned the pages at the rate of a child who could not yet read. He smiled at the cats with the small, wet smile of a child who had been told that smiling was polite. He drank the squash he was given out of the same chipped glass Dudley had once thrown across this parlor, and did not ask for another glass. He looked in every measurable respect like a polite, slow child of 6 who was relieved to be out of the house. Arabella Fig watched him over her knitting and saw a polite, slow child of 6 who was relieved to be out of the house. The Wraith approved. There is, the Wraith had explained, a method of being looked at which is itself a piece of magic. Magic does not require a wand. Magic, in its primal forms, requires only attention deployed at a precise angle. The angle at which a child must be deployed in the presence of a squib of the House of Fig, settled by Albus Dumbledore on this street, is the angle of unworthy interest. The squib must look and see nothing she will report. The squib must register the visit and forget the visitor. The squib must in particular not see the calm with which the child sits, since calm in a child of 6 is a thing which squibs of old families have been trained to recognize. The boy sat with controlled stupidity for 2 hours. The cats washed themselves. Mrs. Fig knitted a brown sleeve. The kettle boiled. The squash was poured. When at 5:20 the boy was collected from the parlor by Petunia, who had been informed by telephone that the cinema visit was over, Mrs. Fig said only, "He's a quiet one, isn't he?" And Petunia said only, "Yes," and the door closed. Back in the kitchen at number 4, with Dudley in the parlor eating chocolate buttons he had not been able to consume at the cinema, the boy sat on the cold tiles in his usual posture and waited to be told whether he had been fed. He had not been fed. He had been given squash. The Wraith made him a small private allowance for the squash and continued. That night in the cupboard, Tom said, "Well done." It was the first time Tom had ever said well done. The boy did not move. He had been instructed at length, and from before he could have understood the instruction, that praise was a poison if accepted as praise. Praise from a teacher was information about the teacher. Praise from the Wraith was a thing the Wraith would, in the years to come, use very rarely and never except as a marker, a marker, that is, of a piece of work which had been done correctly and which was now to be put aside and never to be repeated for its own sake. The boy did not, when receiving the well done, smile in his cupboard. He did not say anything internally back. He did not flush. He listened to the words as he had listened to all the others, with the receptive blankness of a clean slate. The wraith approved. He said after a measured pause, "The woman in that parlor was a squib who has been placed there by Albus Dumbledore to watch you. She did not see you. She saw a boy. She will tell anyone who asks that she saw a boy. We will, in the years to come, find further occasions for her to see a boy and to fail to see you. This is the first such occasion. We have used it well." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said, "Tomorrow we will go to school." The boy said internally, "Yes." Primary school had begun in September. The boy was in the smallest of 3 classes for the year, since the Dursleys had registered him as a slow child for reasons of cover, and the school had accommodated the registration on the strength of his quiet demeanor in his first interview. The teacher was a Mrs. Cathcart, an unmarried woman of about 40, with a beaded chain that held her reading glasses round her neck and a way of saying, "Now then," between sentences. The boy treated Mrs. Cathcart as he treated every adult outside the cupboard, as a feature of weather to be navigated without comment. He read at the level the school expected. He read, in private, at a level several years above that. He had been reading for over a year the books the wraith called to his mind from the inside, the way a child whose grandfather has been a poet sometimes finds the cadences of his grandfather coming up in him before he has learned what the cadences are. The boy did not, in his outward speech, use the cadences. He used the cadences in his head, and they sounded to him as if he were thinking, and he thought in private, in the sentences of a much older man. The trouble at school began with a boy called Piers Polkiss. Piers Polkiss was Dudley's principal ally and the second largest boy in the year. He had been told by Dudley in the previous July that Harry was off limits as a target of friendship and on limits as a target of everything else. Piers had taken the latter half of the instruction with enthusiasm. He had developed over the autumn term the small repertoire of routine cruelties available to a boy of 6 on a school playground: the tripped foot, the snatched bag, the splash from the puddle, the chant. The boy had received the routine cruelties with the same controlled stupidity with which he received the parlor and the kitchen and the cupboard. He had not, in 3 months, given Piers the satisfaction of a reaction. Piers had begun, in November, to escalate. In late November, Piers caught the boy alone behind the bicycle shed. The bicycle shed was a corrugated structure at the back of the playground, which had a thin gravel margin around it. The boy had gone there in the lunch hour because the wraith had told him that the bicycle shed was the one place on the school grounds where the boundary between the dinner ladies' field of vision and the headmaster's window made a corner of nothing, that he could read, behind the shed, for 15 minutes a day without being either supervised or photographed. The boy had taken the suggestion. He had been reading behind the shed a book about insects which Mrs. Cathcart had given him as a slow-class concession. He had been picking through it because it had nothing in it the wraith had not already taught him, and he was practicing reading at the speed of an unsurprised child. Piers came round the corner with 2 of his small followers. The boy looked up. He set the book down on his knees. He waited. Piers said something the wraith did not bother to register, since the registration would have been a waste of attention. The substance of it was that Piers was going to hit Harry and that the other 2 were going to watch. The wraith said, internally, "Do not hit him back." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said, "Do not, however, be hit." The boy said internally, "Yes." Piers took 2 steps and lunged. The boy was not there. He had not, by any measure the boy could later explain, moved. He had taken the lunge with his attention rather than his body, and the attention had refused. The lunge had passed through the patch of gravel on which the boy had been sitting, into a patch of gravel where the boy was not, and Piers had gone face first into the corrugated metal at the back of the shed. The corrugated metal had not been arranged to receive a face. It had received the face with the indifferent geometry of a sheet of stiff tin, and had returned the face in a worse condition than the face had arrived in. Piers staggered back with his hands over his nose. The 2 followers stared. The boy was still sitting on his patch of gravel, 3 feet to the left, with the insect book open on his knees, and the same controlled face he had been wearing when Piers came around the corner. He looked to the followers like a slow child of 6 who had not yet realized that he was about to be hit. The followers looked at Piers. Piers looked at the dinner ladies' field through the gap between the sheds. The dinner ladies' field was empty. Piers thought audibly through his fingers about what to do with the situation. He concluded after some weighing that he had run into the shed without anyone pushing him. He stalked off back to the playground, holding his nose, with the two followers trailing him and refusing to be told what had happened. The boy returned to the insect book. He turned a page at the speed of an unsurprised child. He did not internally congratulate himself. The wraith said internally, "That is the second lesson." The boy said internally, "I remember the first." The wraith said internally, "That is the second." He explained in the cupboard that night the technical content of what had happened. He explained that what the boy had done at the shed was a defensive deviation, a piece of involuntary magic of the kind which any magical child does several times a year, and which ministry trackers will, in the absence of a trace, generally not detect. He explained that the trace did not function in this house, for reasons given before, and that the trace did not function reliably on a playground filled with the static of dozens of nearby children. He explained that the deviation had been small enough and the witness had been embarrassed enough that the school would not, in any record, register it. He explained in the same lesson that the boy must not deviate at the shed again. He must not, because a child who deviates twice at the same shed becomes a child whose deviations are correlated, and correlated deviations are the kind a careful adult can be made to recognize. He must, when next he was attacked, choose another method. The wraith would teach him several methods in the months to come. The boy said internally, yes. The wraith was in fact pleased. He had not, in his planning, been certain that the boy would resist the temptation to do more. A 6-year-old who has just rearranged his geometry to make his bully run into a wall was a 6-year-old at considerable risk of repeating the trick. The boy had not repeated it. The boy had returned to his book. The boy had, in the moments after the deviation, behaved exactly as the wraith would have behaved at 6, which is to say with a discipline so thorough that the discipline itself was invisible to the people around him. The wraith said internally, "We are ahead of schedule." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said, "The next lesson is occlumency." The boy listened. He had heard the word before. He had heard it as a child hears the word physics before he has any idea what physics is. It was a word the wraith had used in 100 sentences over the past year, always with an air of provisional reference, always as if it pointed at a thing the boy would, in due course, get to. The boy understood the word to refer to the discipline of organizing the rooms inside one's head so that no one else could come in. The wraith taught it to him over the winter. He taught it in slow installments in the cupboard while the rain went on outside or the snow fell, or more often the rain pretended to be snow and was simply colder rain. He taught the boy first to build a single room. He taught the boy how to furnish the room. He taught the boy how to fill the room with the kind of distinct decorative detail which, when entered by an outside mind, would consume the outside mind's attention before it had a chance to look for any other room. The boy built a parlor in his head with a coal fire and a deep armchair and a rug woven in a pattern of leaves. He built a small bookshelf along one wall. He built a window which gave on a garden that did not exist. The window opened by the boy's decision on a quiet weather. The garden, by the boy's decision, was a thing the boy had never been to. The boy chose for the contents of his parlor, the contents of an Englishman's parlor as it might have been described in any of a dozen Victorian novels the wraith had given him during the year. The contents were sufficient. The contents were generic. The contents were a place an intruder would, after a few moments of inspection, conclude was nothing of interest. Behind the parlor the boy built a corridor. The corridor was not visible from the parlor. The corridor had no door from the parlor. The corridor was reached by a method the boy and the wraith had invented together over the course of 3 nights, a method which involved a particular movement of attention rather than a particular movement of space. The corridor ran along behind the parlor and had, off it, a number of doors. Each door opened on a room which held a piece of the curriculum. One for the genealogies, one for the Hogwarts geography, one for the Wisengamot, one for the wand families, one for the languages, one for the spells the wraith had begun in the winter to teach the boy in dry form. The doors had locks, the locks had keys. The keys lived in a thing the wraith called the boy's silent vocabulary, which the boy understood to mean a place in his attention nothing else had access to. This took 3 months to build. The boy worked at it in the cupboard for 2 hours each night. He worked at it while at school. He worked at it while sitting on the cold tiles of the kitchen. He worked at it while being scolded by Petunia, since scolding by Petunia required only a face, not an interior. By the end of February the parlor was full and the corridor was complete and the rooms behind the doors were furnished and the locks worked. The wraith said, "Try." The boy tried. The boy let the wraith into the parlor in the cupboard with the small click of attention which was the boy's invitation. The wraith entered the parlor. The wraith looked around the parlor. The wraith was, briefly, the only mind in the parlor. The wraith inspected the window and the bookshelf and the leaf pattern rug. The wraith inspected the fireplace, which was, by the boy's decision, lit. The wraith reached out and tried to find a door. There was no door. There were 3 walls and a window. The window gave on a garden the wraith did not recognize. The wraith looked at the garden carefully. The wraith was briefly a wraith in a parlor with no exit. The wraith said internally, "Very good." The boy said internally, "There is a door." The wraith said internally, "I have not found it." The boy said internally, "That is the point." The wraith was not, by his own standards, easily delighted. He had not been delighted in any sustained way in some 40 years. He found in the cupboard that evening of late February that he experienced a small motion of attention which, in a living body, would have been delight. He filed the motion under satisfaction and continued. He said, "Now I will try legilimency." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith pushed. He pushed from the parlor. He pushed from the window. He pushed from the fireplace. He pushed with the particular pressure that, in a real attack, would have come at the boy from outside himself rather than from inside, but the wraith was the only mind available for the simulation, and the simulation was nevertheless useful. He pushed for nearly an hour. The parlor gave way nowhere. The window gave way nowhere. The fireplace gave way only into a chimney which led to a roof, which led to a sky which was the sky of the garden which the wraith could not enter. The wraith said internally, "Very good." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "Tomorrow we begin legilimency in the other direction." The boy said yes. The boy was 7.5. He could now defend his mind from a fully trained legilimens. He could now, with effort, also enter the mind of any unprotected adult in the house. The first time he did it, on the morning after the parlor was complete, he entered Petunia at breakfast. He did not, of course, enter her with violence. He entered her with the surface scan the wraith had taught him to use first, the gentle inquiry which a properly raised wizard performs as a kind of social grace before he sits down to dinner. He took, in the 4 seconds it occupied, a complete reading of Petunia's mood. She was thinking in the surface of her mind about whether Vernon had eaten the last of the bread. She was thinking under that about whether Mrs. No. 6 had seen her bring in the milk in her hairnet. She was thinking under that about a sister whose name she did not allow herself to use, and about a basket on a step, and about a letter she had read once and burned. The thought of the letter when the boy brushed it glowed. The boy withdrew without disturbing the glow. He had been instructed not to disturb. He withdrew. He sat at the saucer on the kitchen floor and ate his bread. The wraith said internally, "Very good." The boy said internally, "Yes." That afternoon, when Petunia opened the cupboard door at the usual hour to put him in it for an offense which the boy had not committed, but which she had assigned him as a way of clearing the parlor of his presence before Dudley's friends arrived, she stopped at the open door and looked at him. She looked at him as a woman looks at a sound she has heard from a different room. She said, "There's something wrong with you." The boy said nothing. He sat on the cot with his hands folded in his lap. "I always knew," she said. "From the start I knew there's something not right." The boy said nothing. She closed the door. He heard her in the kitchen, sitting at the table for a long time before the kettle was put on for tea. He felt her in his head, distantly, the way one feels a person one has been in the same room with continue to think after they have left it. She did not reopen the door until evening. She did not strike him that night. The wraith said internally, "She will be a problem." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "She is a problem we have already accommodated. She will, between now and your departure for Hogwarts, suspect you in increasing detail. She will not, however, do anything with her suspicion. She does not have anyone to tell. She does not have the courage to ask. She does not have the affection for you required to bring her suspicion into the open as a question. She will simply withdraw by stages from any further interaction with you. This is good. This is in our schedule." The boy said internally, "Yes." By 8, the boy had stopped flinching. Petunia had, over the previous year, gradually given up the apple strike and the saucer set and the hiss at the parlor door, since none of them produced the response a properly trained child was supposed to produce. She had tried, in their place, a campaign of more general withdrawal. She did not feed him at the saucer. She did not feed him at the table. She fed him at unpredictable intervals from the back step. She did not call him to the cupboard. She expected him to be in it. She did not address him in the imperative or in the third person. She did not address him at all. The household had, by the boy's 8th birthday in fact, become a place in which the boy was treated as a piece of weather, present, undeniable, addressed only when it inconvenienced the rest of the household. This suited the wraith. He had told the boy, in the long lessons of the 7th year, that being unaddressed was the best condition under which to be educated. A child who is being addressed by an adult cannot be educated by a different adult. A child who is being ignored by his caretakers can be educated by his teacher in peace. The boy had taken the lesson and lived it. He had absorbed between 7 and 8. the entire shape of British magical politics as it had been in 1981, the entire shape of the European wizarding power structure as it had been in 1981, the entire administrative geography of the Ministry of Magic as it had been in 1981, the entire structure of the Wisengamot as it had been in 1981, and the entire architecture of Hogwarts as it had been in 1944. With the corrections the Wraith proposed for 40 intervening years of cultural and physical drift, he had absorbed it the way a sponge absorbs water. He had absorbed it the way a person absorbs the language of his own childhood, without effort, without notice, without the qualifying anxiety which adults bring to a curriculum. He had also, in the same period, learned to speak with the cadence of a man older than his teachers. He did not, of course, speak in this cadence at school. He spoke at school in the small board register of a slow child of 7 and then of 8, with the small flat consonants the school recognized as the consonants of the children it had been instructed to take in. He had been taught to grade his speech across 3 registers, the school register, the household register, and the cupboard register, and to switch between them at the boundaries of rooms. He never failed at the boundaries. The boundaries had been, for 2 years, the only thing in the world he could fail at, and the only thing in the world Tom had told him he would not be permitted to fail at. He did not fail. At 8, the Wraith began legilimency in the other direction in earnest. The boy practiced on Vernon for the morning entries. The boy practiced on Petunia for the kitchen scans. The boy practiced on Dudley when Dudley was at home, for the experience of inhabiting a mind he could not respect. The boy practiced on Mrs. Figg on the Saturday afternoons he was sent across the road. The boy practiced on Mrs. Cathcart in school on Wednesday afternoons during reading. None of them ever felt anything. The Wraith had taught the boy a touch so light that it did not register against the surface of a mind which had no occlumency to detect with. The Wraith had taught the boy a withdrawal so quick that the surface did not retain any pressure. By the end of the year of his 8th birthday, in fact, the boy had been inside the heads of every adult on the street. He had used this not to know things, but to confirm them. He had confirmed, for example, that the man at number 6 did not, as Petunia suspect her of having had a child outside marriage. He had confirmed that Mrs. Figg reported to no one but herself, that she sent no letters, that she received no owls, and that she would, if questioned, defend the boy as a quiet, polite, slow child. He had confirmed that the headmaster of the primary school regarded him as an undemanding pupil who would, in due course, fail his 11+ and proceed to a comprehensive somewhere and disappear. He had confirmed that none of the adults of Privet Drive had ever, since the morning the basket arrived, asked about the boy. This was good information. The Wraith filed it. In the autumn of his 9th year he saw himself in the mirror. He had not, properly speaking, seen himself in a mirror before. The cupboard had no mirror. The bathroom mirror was at adult height, and he was not allowed in the bathroom except when Vernon was at work and Petunia was at the shops, which was Tuesdays and Thursdays after school. On Tuesdays and Thursdays after school he had been allowed to wash himself at the basin since he was 4. He had stood on a stool in front of the basin and worked at his hands and face by feel. He had not, since he could remember, looked at his face from anywhere except inside it. In the autumn of his 9th year, Petunia bought a hand mirror for her dressing table, a small one with a gilt frame, of the kind a woman buys in a chemist for the inspection of her own eyebrows, and put it down on the parlor table while she went to answer the door. She had been called by Mrs. Number 6. She had stepped out into the hall. The boy had been crossing the parlor to put a basket of dry laundry by the kitchen door, since on Tuesdays and Thursdays after school he was permitted to be useful in low-grade ways. He set the basket down. He went to put it in the kitchen. He came back into the parlor. The mirror was face up on the table. He stopped. He stood for a moment with his hand on the table edge. He picked up the mirror. He held it at a careful angle. He looked. The face that looked back at him was a face he had not been given the description of by anyone. He saw, with the dispassion the Wraith had taught him to apply to all unfamiliar things, that he had a thin face. He had a long nose, narrower than his uncle's, with a small bump on the bridge which his mother had presumably had and which had presumably been passed down. He had dark hair which fell over his forehead in a way that did not, even at 9, conceal the scar. The scar was the shape Tom had described, the stroke of lightning. He had eyes which were a very vivid green. He had not, before this moment, known the color of his own eyes. He looked at himself for perhaps 30 seconds. The Wraith said internally, "Those are your mother's eyes." The boy said internally after a measured pause, "I assumed so." The Wraith said internally, "You have her eyes and your father's bone." The boy said internally, "Yes." He set the mirror down. He aligned it carefully with the angle at which Petunia had set it down so that nothing in her household geometry would suggest he had touched it. He left the parlor. He went back to the kitchen and resumed folding the dry laundry. He did not look at the mirror again that day or any day in the years that followed. He kept the image of his face in one of the rooms behind the corridor. The room was a small one. It contained only the face. The face hung in the room the way a portrait hangs on the wall of a sitting room which is otherwise unused. He visited the room rarely. He visited it always alone. He had not been told to keep the room or to visit it. The wraith had said on the night of the mirror, "Well done." The wraith had not asked on subsequent nights what he had done with the image. The wraith was aware that the boy had built a private room. He had felt the boy build it. He had decided in the cold quarter-second of his deciding about all such matters not to inquire into the room. The room was small. The room contained only an image. The room was the first room the boy had built, which was not on the curriculum. The wraith had thought in the quarter-second that the boy at 9 had earned a single room of his own, since a mind without a single private room is a mind which does not, in the end, function as an instrument, and the boy was being raised as an instrument and would require, at the appropriate scale, the small interior pressures which keep an instrument in tune. The wraith would not enter the room. He would let the boy keep his fate. The boy turned 10 in July of his 9th going into 10th year, by the household's accounting, by the wraith's in the small calendar he kept against the night of the basket. The boy was 9 3/4 and had been his pupil for 8 years and 8 months. In the spring of the boy's 10th year, the wraith arranged for a small artifact to find its way to the boy. He arranged it with a degree of effort he had not previously been able to spend. He had been gathering over the years a degree of pressure he could apply through the tether, the kind of pressure that could, with patience, nudge a squib of an old family into a particular corner of her parlor at a particular hour, or persuade an owl to choose one window over another, or convince a postman to put a particular package in a particular slot. He had spent 6 months arranging the nudge. The nudge resulted in the delivery to the front step of number 4 of a small parcel addressed to Master H.J. Potter. Petunia found it. Petunia, by now, opened nothing addressed to the boy. She left the parcel in the umbrella stand and forgot about it. The boy collected it from the umbrella stand at the end of the day and took it to the cupboard. He opened it. It contained a brass coin the size of a sixpence threaded on a leather cord. The coin was very plain on one side and had on the other a small engraved sigil which the boy did not recognize. The wraith said internally, "That is a trace stripper." The boy listened. The wraith said internally, "It is an old artifact of the Selwyn family. It is, by my arrangement, missing from the Selwyn vault and presumed mislaid. It will, while you wear it, dampen any trace signature you produce to a magnitude below the ministry's threshold of detection. It will not make you invisible to a fully alert aura. It will make you invisible to the automatic registers of the ministry's central office. We will in the year ahead use it sparingly since the dampening is itself a signature if used repeatedly in the same week. We will, however, wear it always." The boy hung the cord around his neck under his shirt. The shirt was a hand-me-down of Dudley's which Petunia had decided was the only shirt the boy was permitted on Saturdays. The shirt smelled of Dudley. The cord did not smell of anything. The wraith said internally, "Now we will practice." The boy said internally, "Yes." They practiced through the spring and into the summer. The boy learned in his cupboard to summon a button from his cot to his hand by attention. He learned to turn a glass of water in his cupboard slowly counterclockwise on the cot floor by attention. He learned to light a single piece of dust to a faint glow by attention. He learned, in the back garden on the days he was sent out, to make the grass at his feet bend in any direction he liked. He learned, in the kitchen at night when the household was asleep and Petunia had stopped checking the cupboard, to lift the cupboard door's hook from its eye and lower it again with a sound exactly like the sound the hook made when one's mother lowered it. These were small magics. The wraith had taught him to keep them small. The wraith had said that an apprentice's magic was best practiced in the millimetric range, since a wand at 11 would require a steadiness which only millimetric practice could give. The boy practiced in the millimetric range with the patience of a teacher who had already decided to be excellent. He turned 10 by the wraith's calendar. He turned 10 by the household's. The two calendars matched in this matter. He was given on his 10th birthday, in fact, no observation by the household. He was given in the cupboard that night an hour of lesson on the Wisengamot's procedural calendar by the wraith. He was, at 10, ready. The Hogwarts letter arrived in late July. It came, as the wraith had said it would, on an owl. The owl was a fine large tawny which sat on the parlor windowsill with the letter in its beak and tapped against the glass. Petunia, who was vacuuming the carpet at the time and who had in 11 years been waiting for this letter with the particular dread of a woman who knows that her sister's daughter's son will, in due course, be addressed by the school her sister had attended, screamed. Vernon came in from the garden, saw the owl, saw the letter, took both at once and walked them out to the bin. The boy was in the kitchen. He had heard the owl. He had felt through the wraith the precise impression of the address on the front of the envelope. He had been told the previous winter exactly what the address would say and exactly which initials would precede his surname and exactly which sigil would be on the wax. He waited. Vernon came in from the bin, slammed the back door and said, "If another one of those things comes near this house, I'll wring its neck." Petunia, who had stopped vacuuming, said, "There'll be more." Vernon said, "There won't." Petunia said, "There will." The boy stood at the kitchen doorway in his hand-me-down shirt with his hand at his side and his face controlled and said in his school register, "What is it?" Petunia and Vernon looked at him. He kept the school register on his face for a count of 3. Then he let it slide by a quarter degree into the household register in which his face was permitted a small confusion. He held the confusion. He did not push for further information. Petunia said after a long moment, "Nothing." "Nothing at all. Go and clean the upstairs windows." The boy went upstairs and cleaned the windows. While he was cleaning the upstairs windows, he extracted, through the open back door, 3 more letters which had arrived in the course of the morning, each by owl, each on the same paper, each addressed to him at cupboard under the stairs, number 4 Privet Drive. He read one of them in the cupboard that night by the light of his torch. He had by now the torch the wraith had taught him to wandlessly recharge. The letter was, as he had known it would be, the letter from the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, requesting that he confirm his attendance no later than 31 July. The wraith said internally, "Now we begin the public phase." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "You will write the reply tonight. I will give you the wording. You will use the writing materials your aunt has put away in the kitchen drawer she does not check on Wednesdays. You will not use either initial of your name in the postscript. You will, however, sign as Harry. You will be Harry to them in print from now on." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "Tomorrow, when the next letter comes, and a next letter will come, because Albus Dumbledore is a man who has, for 50 years, used Hagrid as a personally collected envelope, we will meet Hagrid. We will meet Hagrid in the public phase. We will use Hagrid as Hagrid will expect to be used. We will smile at him. We will be surprised. We will be a kind, small, wide-eyed boy who has never heard of magic." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "We will in due course also meet Diagon Alley, which I have given you in 3 dimensions for the last 6 years, and which you will tomorrow be expected to see with the appropriate wonder. You will produce the wonder." The boy said, "Yes." The wraith said internally, with the satisfaction of a man inspecting an inheritance he is about, after 11 years, to begin spending, "We have done well." The boy said internally in the cadence of an older man in the register of the cupboard, "Yes." Outside, the summer night was warm. The household was quiet. The boy lay on his cot with the torch off and the brass coin warm against his sternum, and listened to the wraith finish the last lesson of the curriculum that had been delivered in private, the lesson on how to receive Rubeus Hagrid the next morning, and how to receive Ollivander a day later, and how to receive Draco Malfoy and Madame Malkins, and how to receive Severus Snape at the welcoming feast, and how to receive Albus Dumbledore from across a hall. The wraith finished at 1 in the morning. He said internally, "Rest." The boy rested. The wraith laid himself out along the cupboard wall in the posture which he had now occupied for 8 years and 8 months, against the slope of the underside of the stairs, and considered the morning ahead. He had a body of work behind him which he had not, in his planning, dared to hope for. He had a pupil who, by any reasonable measure, was the most thoroughly prepared child in the history of magical education. He had an apparatus of secrecy which the household had constructed for him, and the wraith had refined into a complete operational discipline. He had an artifact at the boy's throat that would, for the year ahead, keep them invisible to the trace. He had above all the only thing in the long quiet decade he had not been certain he would have, an heir. He thought, "Tomorrow we go out among them." He thought, "Tomorrow they will think they have him." He thought, "They will be wrong." The boy slept, the wraith stayed. Outside an owl flew across the moon and away. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, Sordid Slytherin. At 11 Hagrid came in the morning. He came, as the wraith had predicted, on the day after the 3rd letter had been intercepted by Vernon and burned. He came at 20 past 11 by a measurement which the boy made through the kitchen window, in a tweed greatcoat the size of a small tent, with a face the boy had been given the description of in cupboard installments since he was 4. The boy recognized the beard before the body. He recognized the wardrobe man. He did not, by even the smallest motion of attention, let the recognition show. He had been taught to greet Hagrid as a polite, small, wide-eyed boy who had never heard the word magic. He greeted Hagrid that way. He did it in the front hall, with Vernon shouting in the parlor about salesmen and Petunia braced against the kitchen doorframe with her hands over the chain of her cardigan, and he did it well. He let his eyes go a little large. He let his mouth open by perhaps 1/8 of an inch. He held still while Hagrid lowered the letter into his hand and said, in the voice of a man who had practiced this scene in a number of front halls over the years, "You're a wizard, awry." The boy said in the household register quietly, "I'm a what?" He held his face on the held breath of a child who has been told an impossible thing. He produced, after the count of 3, a small bewildered smile. He looked at Hagrid as he had been instructed to look, as one looks at a giant of a man who has come to one's front door with a letter under his arm and a kindness in his face. He let the kindness register on him as a child registers something he has never seen before. Hagrid was charmed. It took Hagrid most of the day to be charmed. They spent the day in London because the Wraith had told the boy that the day should be spent in London. The Wraith had said in the cupboard the night before that Hagrid was the cleanest courier Albus Dumbledore had ever employed in a long career of indirect communication, and that the day in London was a day during which Albus Dumbledore would in effect be courting the boy by proxy. The boy would, accordingly, be courted. The boy would be charmed by Diagon Alley. The boy would, the Wraith said, please attend particularly to the leaky cauldron, which would be packed with small, low-status wizards who had been waiting 11 years to shake his hand, and would receive the handshakes with the bewilderment of an entirely unprepared child of 11. The boy received the handshakes with the bewilderment of an entirely unprepared child of 11. It was, the Wraith later observed, an excellent piece of performance. The boy had been touched by, in the 4 minutes the introductions occupied, the hands of Doris Crockford, Diggle's wife, 4 small wizards whose names the boy noted in the genealogical room behind the corridor for later cross-reference, and 1 man named Quirinus Quirrell. The boy paused at Quirrell. He paused in his face by perhaps 1/10 of a second. He recovered in his face before either Quirrell or Hagrid could notice. In the corridor behind the parlor, the boy went, very quickly and without telling the Wraith he was doing it, into the room marked Tom and asked. The Wraith said internally, "Not yet." The Wraith said internally, "Not now, not here, be charmed, be polite, receive him as a small frightened man in a turban, take note of the turban, take note of the eyes, take note of the small twitch of the right hand when he touches you, do not look behind him. Do not, in any motion of attention, reach for the back of his head. You will be told in due course why I am telling you these things. You will not, in this minute or in any minute today, ask me again." The boy said internally, "Yes." He let his hand be shaken. He produced a polite confusion. He said, "Pleased to meet you, sir." Quirrell stuttered something at him and let him go and stepped sideways with the small bobbing motion of a man who had not, in some years, occupied his own bones with any comfort. The boy walked on into Diagon Alley. He had been given Diagon Alley by the Wraith in 3-dimensional detail for the last 6 years of the curriculum. He had walked it in the cupboard by his attention on 100 nights. He had memorized the order of the shops, the breaks between them, the alleys that ran off the south side, the small pasted shops which had appeared since 1981, and which the Wraith had identified for him through the local press of 7 intervening years that the Wraith had instructed him to read at Mrs. Cathcart's class on Wednesdays. He had walked Diagon Alley so often inside himself that the sight of it from outside himself was the disorienting one. He produced, with a careful effort, the wonder Hagrid had been waiting for. He looked up at the painted signs, he looked at the broomsticks, he looked at the cauldrons. He let his hand rise involuntarily to his mouth at the dragons. Hagrid was pleased. Hagrid took him to Gringotts. The Wraith had given the boy the lecture on goblins twice in May and once in late June, and the boy bowed to the goblin at the desk and said, "Good morning, sir," and the goblin's small black eyes shifted on him for a quarter of a second longer than was usual for an 11-year-old, and the goblin said, "Good morning." Hagrid said in the cart that the Potter vault had been left untouched for a decade, and that the gold was the boy's, and that the boy was, by goblin standards, comfortable. The vault was comfortable. The boy stood at the threshold of the vault for the appropriate 4 seconds, and took in the heaps of coins with the appropriate dilation. He filled his pouch under Hagrid's direction. He did not, by any motion of attention, look at the small dark inset on the back wall, which the Wraith had told him on the previous night was the storage niche for a number of small Potter family artifacts, including a brass-hinged box he was to identify and not touch. He identified the box without touching it. He noted in the room behind the door marked vault the precise dimensions of the box and the precise position of the brass hinges. He stepped out of the vault. He let Hagrid lead him to a second vault at a lower level. The Wraith had not warned him about the second vault, since the Wraith had not, in 1981, known what would be in it, and watched Hagrid retrieve a small dirty package the size of a snitch, which Hagrid put in the inner pocket of his greatcoat without looking at the boy. The boy did not look at the package. He did, however, in the corridor behind the parlor, in a room he had not previously built, write down the precise impression of the package in the precise weight of Hagrid's pocket. He did not yet know what the package was. He had been told by the Wraith that Hagrid would carry from one of the lower vaults a thing of importance which he would not be expected to identify, and he had been instructed to register the thing without identifying it. He registered it. He continued the day. He went to Madame Malkin's. He stood on the stool. The small pale boy on the next stool, blond, slight, sharper-faced than Dudley by an order of magnitude, looked at him with the small civic interest of a boy who had been told to mark anyone he had not previously met. The boy looked back. He produced a polite school register face. He gave his name when asked. He answered the questions about his summer. He let the pale boy talk about his father. He let the pale boy say, with the bored sneer of a boy whose father had taught him to use a bored sneer at moments which warranted it, the names of two families the Wraith had taught the boy to associate with the deepest of the Loyalist purebloods. He let the names pass through his face without acknowledgement and through the cupboard register without storage. The Wraith said internally in the cupboard register, "He is offering you Malfoy." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "Do not accept, do not refuse, be politely uncertain. Let him reach for you twice more before you decide. He must come to you. You must not by any motion of attention come to him. He must learn that your alliance is a thing he has had to work for. He is the right kind of boy for this lesson. His father has trained him to expect deference from those beneath him, and your distance will read to him as a problem to be solved." The boy said internally, "Yes." He let Draco Malfoy talk. He listened. He produced, after several minutes, a small pleasant sentence which Draco recognized as a non-acceptance. Madame Malkin pinned his robes. The pale boy left first. The boy paid for his robes from the pouch Hagrid had filled. He went out into Diagon Alley. He went to Ollivander's an hour later, after Hagrid had bought him an owl, after Hagrid had bought him a trunk, after Hagrid had bought him his books and his cauldron and the small parchment and quill kit of the Hogwarts standard list. The owl was a snowy female of an age the Wraith had judged to be 11 months. The boy was permitted to name her. He named her Hedwig. The name had been the Wraith's suggestion. The Wraith had said in the cupboard that the name Hedwig would read to all wizarding adults as the name of a child who had read his Bathilda Bagshot. It would read as a small piece of self-instruction. It would identify the boy to anyone who heard it as a boy who had taught himself a careful history out of the available reading. It would not identify him as a boy who had been taught by a master. The boy named the owl Hedwig. He smiled at Hagrid. Hagrid was pleased again. Hagrid said, "You're a clever un-Rai." The boy looked at Hagrid with the small, wide, grateful look the Wraith had refined in the previous June. He said, "Thank you." Ollivander's was a low, dark shop in a narrow street with one window full of dust and a small bell on the door. The Wraith had said in the cupboard the previous night that Ollivander was the only adult in Diagon Alley whose attention to a child was sustained and whose attention to a wand bonding was professional, and that Ollivander would, accordingly, be the only adult of the day in front of whom the boy would have to perform at a higher register than the bewildered child register he had used at the Leaky Cauldron. The boy stepped into the shop. The bell rang. Ollivander stood up behind the desk. His pale moon-like face turned toward the boy. He did not, in the 4 seconds it took the boy to cross the floor, blink. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I wondered when I should see you, Mr. Potter." The boy let his face register an appropriate confusion. "Your father preferred mahogany," Ollivander said. 11 inches, pliable, excellent for transfiguration. Your mother willow, 10 1/4, swishy, lovely for charms. The wand chooses the wizard, of course, Mr. Potter, and we shall see what chooses you." He produced from behind the desk a box. The boy took the wand inside it. He waved it. Nothing happened. He took the second wand and waved it. The dust on the shelf moved. Ollivander said, "Try this." He produced from behind a higher shelf a long, thin box. He took the box down. He opened it. He removed from it a wand the boy had been told to expect, 11 inches, holly, with a single phoenix tail feather of an order of magnitude not commonly found in the working stock. The wand was given into the boy's hand. The boy held it. He felt instantly a warmth which he had been told to expect, and which he did not, by any visible flicker, register on his face. He felt instantly a second warmth which he had not been told to expect, and which the Wraith had not predicted, and which read along his right arm like an electrical recognition of an old friend. The Wraith said internally, in a tone the boy had never heard him use. Ah, the boy did not move. He held the wand still in his hand. The dust on the shelves around him stirred. A small sheen of red and gold light came out of the wand's tip and moved across the desk and settled. Ollivander made a small sound which was not, by his standards, an exclamation. He said, "Curious, curious." He took the wand back. He put it in its box. He said, "The wand chose you, Mr. Potter. I should expect great things from you. After all, he who must not be named did great things. Terrible, yes, but great." The boy widened his eyes by the appropriate margin. He paid for the wand. He said, "Thank you, sir." He left the shop. In the street, he did not look back at the window. In the corridor behind the parlor, he opened the door of the room marked Tom and asked. The wraith said internally, "The brother core." The wraith said internally, "I had not known." The boy waited. The wraith said internally, in the cadence of a man who has discovered a piece of architecture he had himself built without remembering. "The phoenix that gave its tail to my wand also gave a tail to yours. You hold in your hand the brother of my wand." This is a piece of information which is, properly speaking, an advantage. It is also a piece of information which Albus Dumbledore will know about by the end of the week. Ollivander reports everything to him. We will use the report. We will use Ollivander's curiosity. We will use the fact that Albus Dumbledore will, when he learns of the brother core, reach a certain conclusion about you which he will spend the year acting on. The boy said internally, "Which conclusion?" The wraith said internally, "That you are a piece of me he has not yet identified." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "He is correct." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "He does not know how correct." The day in London ended at the Leaky Cauldron at 4 in the afternoon. Hagrid handed the boy back to the door of number 4. The boy received Hagrid's last avuncular pat on the shoulder. He carried his trunk to the cupboard. He put the wand in the cupboard with the trunk. He went up to dinner. He ate. He came back to the cupboard. He shut the door. He sat on the cot. He took the wand out of the box. He held it across his palms in the way the wraith had been describing to him for 2 years. He felt the warmth again, more steadily than in the shop. He felt with the wand in his hand that the curriculum of 8 years and 8 months was, for the first time, in physical possession of an instrument. The wraith said internally, "Rest. The train is in 5 days." The boy rested. On the morning of the 1st of September, the boy walked through the wall between platforms 9 and 10 at King's Cross with the small, frightened look the wraith had told him to wear, and emerged onto the platform at the other side with the small wonder the wraith had told him to wear, and made his way down the train at a measured pace looking for a compartment which the wraith had told him to choose. He found the compartment in the 5th car. The compartment had one boy in it, a red-haired boy of his own age with a smudge on his nose. The wraith had said in the cupboard that he was to share a compartment for the journey with a Weasley of the youngest fertile generation, since a Weasley would, for Albus Dumbledore's benefit, be the appropriate first associate of the boy on the train. The boy slid the door open. He said, "Excuse me, is anyone sitting here?" The red-haired boy said, "Not really." The boy sat. He put his trunk above. He produced on his face a small, careful school register smile. He answered the red-haired boy's questions in the small board register of a polite stranger. He did not, at any point, identify himself until he was directly asked. When asked, he gave his name. The red-haired boy stared at his forehead. The boy let the staring happen. The red-haired boy said after several seconds, "Are you really?" The boy said, "Yes." The red-haired boy said, "I'm Ron Weasley." The boy said, "Pleased to meet you." They were not interrupted for nearly 2 hours. They ate pumpkin pasties. They ate Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. They had a polite conversation about Quidditch, which the boy navigated by letting the red-haired boy talk and asking the small, uninformed questions of a child who had been raised by Muggles and who had only just heard of the game. He had, in fact, been given the rules of Quidditch in cupboard installments for 2 years. He kept the cupboard register out of his face. He produced, instead, the registered ignorance of a Muggle-raised 11-year-old. Twice the door slid open. Twice the wraith's small predicted arrivals came in. The first was the bushy-haired girl in the new robe with the rabbit's front teeth, looking for the toad of a boy with a round face who had been sent on at King's Cross by a grandmother in stork-knit black. The girl introduced herself with the small, over-formal stiffness of a child who had been raised by parents who had been told that the school was important and who had practiced the introduction in the mirror. Hermione Granger. The boy received the name. He registered the family Muggle-born, the wraith said, internally, no political weight, and he produced the bored, polite reception of an 11-year-old who had not yet decided whether to like her. She left. The second was Draco Malfoy with 2 large boys behind him. He stood in the doorway and proposed, in his bored sneer, that the boy join him for the rest of the ride. The boy looked at him with the same small, uncertain face he had used at Madame Malkin's. He produced, after a count, a polite refusal, not a rude one. He said in the school register, "I think I'll stay here for now." Draco's face closed. He said in the voice of a small boy who had been told by his father how to take a refusal and had not quite learned the lesson, "You'll find out that some wizarding families are better than others, Potter. I can help you there. Don't go making friends with the wrong sort." The boy let his face be politely puzzled. He said, "Thank you, I'll keep that in mind." Draco left. The compartment door slid shut. The red-haired boy said, "What an arse." The boy did not, in the school register, agree. He said he seems serious about his family. The red-haired boy snorted. The wraith said internally in the cupboard register, "Very good. You did not insult him. You did not accept him. You have set in his head a small problem he will be unable to solve for the entirety of his first year, namely whether you are an ally to be courted or an enemy to be despised. He will in either case be drawn to you. He will, in any group of Slytherin first-years, defer to you within the month." The boy said internally, "Yes, the train arrived. The boats arrived." The boy crossed the lake with Hagrid at the prow and the castle rising out of the dark, and produced the small, involuntary intake of breath which had been written into him as a child by a teacher who knew, very precisely, when an 11-year-old's breath was supposed to catch. He stepped into the entrance hall in a small group with Ron Weasley on one side and the round-faced Toad Boy on the other, and waited. McGonagall came down the steps. The wraith had given him McGonagall in 3 dimensions 10 times in the previous year. He recognized the carriage. He recognized the green of the robes. He recognized the small, thin mouth which had been the mouth on the doorstep at Privet Drive 11 years ago, and he did not, by any motion of attention, look at her with anything other than the bewildered interest of a child seeing his head of house for the first time. She gave them the speech. He let the speech land. They went in. The Great Hall was a thing the wraith had taken pains over. He had drawn it for the boy 100 nights running in the previous 6 years, ceiling and tables and torches and the dais and the staff seats. The boy walked in. He saw it for the first time as a body sees a thing one has visited only by attention. He took the small breath of an 11-year-old who has crossed the threshold of the place he has, on some level he cannot yet name, always been moving toward. The breath was sincere. The wraith had not, for the breath, written him an instruction. The wraith had let him have it. The hat sat on its stool. The hat sang. The boy did not bother to listen. The hat called names. It called Hannah Abbott, Hufflepuff. It called Susan Bones, Hufflepuff. It called Terry Boot, Ravenclaw. It called Mandy Brocklehurst, Ravenclaw. It called Lavender Brown, Gryffindor. It called Millicent Bulstrode, Slytherin. It called Justin Finch Fletchley, Hufflepuff. It called Seamus Finnegan, eventually Gryffindor. It called Hermione Granger after a hesitation of nearly a minute, Gryffindor. It called Neville Longbottom after a similar hesitation, Gryffindor. It called Draco Malfoy at the back of the line. The hat barely touched his head, Slytherin. It called Harry Potter. The hall went quiet. The boy walked the length of the room with the unhurried small steps of an 11-year-old who had been told that one walked slowly when one was being watched. He climbed the small step. He turned around. He sat on the stool. He felt McGonagall lower the hat onto his head. The hat said internally in a voice the boy received with the same quiet attention with which he had received all other voices for 8 years and 8 months. Difficult, very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind, either. There's talent, oh my goodness, yes, and a nice thirst to prove yourself. Now that's interesting, and the hat paused. The hat said internally in a voice slightly different, "Oh. Oh dear," the boy said internally, "I had wondered if you would notice." The hat said internally, I have never, there is a piece of, the boy said internally in the cupboard register, there is a piece of him in my forehead, I know, I have known for as long as I have been able to know anything. Sort me where he wants me sorted. The hat said internally, this is highly irregular. The boy said internally, it is. Where would you have sorted me without the piece? The hat hesitated. It said internally, Gryffindor, possibly, possibly not. You have the cunning for Slytherin and the courage for Gryffindor and the mind for Ravenclaw, and the boy said internally, where would Tom have wanted me? The hat said internally, Slytherin. The boy said internally, then there. The hat said internally after a pause, I will sort you where I would have sorted you anyway. The hat said aloud, Slytherin. The hall did not gasp. It made instead the small startled noise of a room of 1,000 wizards and witches who had not, in any of their preparatory whispers about the famous boy, expected this outcome. The Slytherin table burst, after a delay of perhaps 2 seconds, into a cheer of a particular careful kind, the cheer of a house which had been waiting for a long time for a piece of news. The boy stood up. He took off the hat. He handed it to McGonagall. He did not look at her face. He had been told not to. He walked in the unhurried small steps of an 11-year-old who has just become the most discussed first year in the history of Slytherin House to the table at the far left of the room. He sat at the end. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked up the table. At the staff table at the far end, a man with a hooked nose and a curtain of dark hair was watching him. The boy met the man's eyes for exactly the count of one. He let his eyes slide off and forward. He did not look at Quirrell. He did not look at Dumbledore. The wraith said internally in the cupboard register, "Very good." The boy said internally, "Yes." The feast began. He ate. He listened. He let himself be addressed by a sixth-year prefect named Gemma Farley, who had the small, careful manners of a girl whose grandmother had been a Wisengamot member, and he gave her his name, and he gave her the polite thanks of a first-year who had been told that he should listen to his prefects. He did not, by any motion of attention, ever turn his face up the table to the staff dais. Snape watched him for the entirety of the feast. Snape watched him with the small, narrow attention of a man who had been waiting 11 years to see a face, and who had at last been given that face from across a room, and was being asked, on no notice, to determine what to do with it. The boy felt the watching. He did not look back. The dorm, when they were finally taken down to it after Farley's speech in the common room about the rules and the password, and the discretion the house expected of its first years, was a long stone room down a corridor under the lake. The water made the small green shifting light on the wall the wraith had described to him in the cupboard in the November of his 8th year. The beds were green curtained. The boy's was the third on the left. His trunk had already been brought down. His owl was at the owlery. His wand was in his pocket. He sat on the bed. The other 4 boys of his year sat on theirs. Draco Malfoy was the closest. The other 3 were Crabbe, Goyle, and a slighter boy named Theodore, not whose family the wraith had marked as second-tier ally with first-tier ambition. The 4 watched the boy with the small, careful watching of boys who had been told by their fathers what they were to do if they ended up in a dorm with Harry Potter. The boy said in the school register, mildly, "Well, good evening." The 4 said in approximate unison in the small, careful school register of well-brought-up boys, "Good evening." He undressed. He folded his clothes. He put on his nightshirt, which was a hand-me-down of Dudley's the wraith had instructed him to keep for the journey and not to display to Madame Malkin. He climbed into the bed. He drew the green curtains. He lay down. The wraith said internally in the cupboard register, in the register he had used in the cupboard at Privet Drive for 8 years and 8 months, "Rest." The boy rested. The wraith said internally, "Tomorrow is potions." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "Snape will be there. Snape will probe. Snape will, in the manner of his best teaching, ask you the questions whose answers an ordinary first year cannot have. You will answer them. You will answer them in a careful register. You will not answer them in the cupboard register. You will answer them in the register of a precocious 11-year-old who has read his Bathilda the Bagshot and his Beginner's Guide to Potions and has talked to Malfoy on the train. You will give Snape in the answer exactly the amount of cleverness which Snape will permit himself to credit. You will not give him more. The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "You will let him think you are bright. You will not let him think you are mine." The boy said internally, "Yes." He slept. The next morning in the cold dungeon of the potions classroom, the boy sat in the front row with Draco at his elbow and his cauldron set up and his quill ready, and waited for Snape to come through the door. Snape came through the door at exactly the appointed minute. He went to the dais. He looked over the room. He gave the small, contemptuous opening monologue which the wraith had warned the boy about in cupboard installments for several years, and which the boy let land on him with the small, respectful attentiveness of an 11-year-old who had decided to be liked by his head of house. Snape's eyes settled on him. "Mr. Potter," Snape said. "Our new celebrity." The boy looked at him with no movement of his face. "Tell me, Potter," Snape said, "what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormhood?" The boy waited the small count of one which the wraith had instructed him to use for any answer he wished to be taken as effortful but knowable. He said evenly in the school register, "The draft of living death, sir." Snape's mouth made the small movement of an adult who has been caught off guard. "Where," Snape said, "would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" The boy said, "The stomach of a goat, sir." "What is the difference," Snape said, "between monkshood and wolfsbane?" The boy said evenly, "They are the same plant, sir, also known as aconite." The room was silent. Snape said after a measured beat, "Well, it seems fame isn't everything. A point to Slytherin for being able to read a book, Potter. 5 from Gryffindor, Mr. Weasley, for staring at your friend instead of answering." He turned to the board. The boy did not look at Draco. He did not look at the back of the room. He did not look at Snape. He took the quill in his hand. He copied the brewing instructions from the board. He brewed his potion. He brewed it correctly. He did not, by any motion of attention, do better than well. At the end of the class, he packed his cauldron. He left the dungeon with the others. He went up the spiral stair to the corridor of the kitchens, which would lead him to the second of his classes. The wraith said internally in the cupboard register, "He will write to Dumbledore tonight." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "He will write that you are bright, polite, and possibly an ally. He will write that he did not see in you what he expected to see. He will, in the writing, be deciding whether to like you. He will lean toward like. He will be uncertain. He will, in the year to come, be the most interesting variable to manage. We will manage him." The boy said internally, "Yes." The first week of his term passed in this fashion. The boy was bright in every class. He was polite to every teacher. He sat with Draco at the Slytherin table and made the small, careful, pureblood courteous remarks which the wraith had cultivated in his vocabulary across the long curriculum, and Draco's face thawed in stages over the week, and by Friday Draco was sitting beside him in every meal and treating him as the unofficial second of his small dorm group. The boy did not become Draco's friend. He let Draco become his attendant. The other three followed Draco. The other three followed the boy because Draco followed the boy. The dorm of first-year Slytherin boys settled within a week into a small functional hierarchy with the boy at the top. By no instruction the boy had given, the wraith approved. On the night of the first Friday after the dorm had gone to sleep, the boy slipped out of his bed, and out of the dorm in the soft slippers the wraith had instructed him to procure from the school stockroom, and walked the corridors of the dungeons in the silence the wraith had described to him at length the previous summer. He walked, by attention, the route he had been given. He took the stair behind the brewing storeroom. He took the small side corridor behind the Slytherin common room. He took the door which had not, since 1944, been opened by a teacher of any kind, and which the wraith had taught him how to find by the small irregularity in the stone above the lintel. The corridor behind the door was the survey route the wraith had drawn for him on a night in late April. The boy walked it. He walked through the lower vault of the Hogwarts foundations in the cold dark with the brass coin warm at his throat and his wand in his right hand and his attention in the cupboard register. He noted at each junction the small irregularities the wraith had described. He noted at the third left the small alcove which contained a wooden chest he was instructed not to open. He noted at the fifth right the small recess which contained a portrait of a man the wraith had told him not to look at. He noted at the seventh left the alcove which contained the artifact which the wraith had told him, in the cupboard installments of August, was the artifact they would use at Christmas against the headmaster. The artifact was a black stone egg the size of a fist on a tripod of bronze. The boy did not approach it. He memorized its position. He stepped back. He returned by the same route to the dorm. He climbed into his bed. He drew the curtains. He slept. The wraith said in the last moment before the boy slept in the cupboard register he had now used in a real cupboard and in a stone alcove and in a dungeon dormitory. Very good. The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "The survey is complete. We have until December." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "Quirrell is in October." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "Rest." The boy slept. Above him in the headmaster's office at the top of the school, Albus Dumbledore stood at his window for a long time, with the small folded report from Severus Snape in one hand and the small folded report from Garrick Ollivander in the other, and watched the lake. He did not for some hours write anything down. He did eventually decide that he would, in due course, ask the boy to tea. He turned away from the window. The boy slept. The castle slept. The lake breathed. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Quirrell and the Dungeon Reunion. The boy watched Quirrell for 6 weeks before Quirrell spoke to him. He watched him in the defense against the dark arts classroom on the 3rd floor twice a week from the 2nd row. He watched him at the staff table at dinner. He watched him in the corridors, on the staircases, in the moments before and after class. He watched him with the small flat attention which the wraith had taught him to use on subjects of interest in the presence of subjects of greater interest. Snape was the greater interest. Quirrell, for the duration of the watching, was a quiet study. The watching produced data. The first datum was that Quirrell stuttered. The stutter was not the stutter of a man with a speech impediment. The boy had been taught in the curriculum on legilimency to read voices the way other children read faces. The wraith had given him in the cupboard the sound and shape of half a dozen kinds of stutter, congenital, traumatic, drink-related, possession-related, magical, and the boy had memorized them as one memorizes the calls of birds in a field guide. The stutter Quirrell produced in the defense classroom was the 5th on the list. It was the stutter of a man whose mouth had been borrowed. The second datum was that the stutter was not consistent. It was deepest in the first 10 minutes of class, when Quirrell had not yet warmed into the lesson. It eased in the middle when the lesson had hold of him. It returned sharper in the last 5 minutes of the class, at exactly the moments when the boy would, by chance, find his own attention turning toward the back of the room or the high window or the small chalkboard on which Quirrell had written the lesson's title. The stutter sharpened, in other words, in correlation with the boy's own attention. It was not, the boy concluded, correlated with Quirrell. It was correlated with whatever in Quirrell was watching Quirrell. The third datum was that the turban smelled of garlic. It smelled of garlic at a distance of 3 feet, which the boy verified on a Tuesday in early October when Quirrell paused at the end of the second row to compliment the boy on his essay. The garlic smell was strong enough that several of the other students made faces. The boy did not make a face. He thanked Quirrell. He held still while Quirrell, in the small bobbing motion of a man who could not, in the boy's presence, keep his head entirely steady, leaned over his desk to indicate a line he had marked in red. He felt in the moment of the leaning a small cold pressure on the back of his own forehead, a pressure that came not from the room but from the tether, from Tom, who had felt through him what Quirrell had felt through Quirrell. The wraith said internally in a register the boy had heard from him in the wand shop. Ah, the boy said internally after the leaning had passed and Quirrell had moved on to the next row. Yes. The wraith said internally, he is the one. The boy said internally, yes. The wraith said internally, he has been the one since King's Cross. I had wished to confirm. I have confirmed. The boy said internally, how? The wraith said internally, by the cold under your scar. The boy did not by any motion of attention touch his own scar. The wraith said internally, I will not now in this room make further contact with him. He is not yet braced. I will in October brace him by a method we will discuss. I will in October also brace you. The boy said internally, yes. The wraith said internally, you will, between now and the brace, do nothing visible. You will continue to be a polite student of defense. You will write your essays in the small, over-careful penmanship of a precocious 11-year-old who has been raised by Muggles and is taking his first wizarding class. You will not in any of your essays identify a single shape of magic by its proper old name. You will, in particular, not identify the technique I gave you in the cupboard last March, which is the technique by which a soul fragment may be lodged in a host body. You will not in any conversation outside this dorm demonstrate that you know that technique exists. The boy said internally, yes. The wraith said internally in the cupboard register, I have waited many years to embrace my heir. I will wait 1 more month for the embrace to be done correctly. The boy said internally, yes. October passed in this way. The boy continued his terms. He continued his polite performance in every class. He continued, with Draco at his elbow, to govern the small functional hierarchy of the first-year Slytherin boys. He continued to sit beside Theodore not at meals when Draco was elsewhere, and to receive from not, in the small clipped pureblood register of a child of a house the wraith had taught him to admire, the information of the corridors. He continued to walk twice a week down to the Dungeon Potions classroom and to be the first into the cauldron and the last out, with Snape's slow attention moving over him and never deciding. He continued to extract from the textbook he had been issued in defense the small clues the wraith said would be planted there. There were 3. The first was in the chapter on resistive charms. It was a paragraph the wraith had not previously seen, written, the wraith identified, not by the textbook's nominal author but by Quirrell himself, in a careful hand which mimicked the textbook's font and had been inserted between 2 pages by a binding charm. The paragraph described in the small overformal cadence of a paranoid man's instructional voice the proper preparation of a candle for a long ward. The boy read the paragraph twice. He understood it the second time as an instruction to himself. Light in the dorm on the second Wednesday of October, a single candle by a particular small spell which the wraith had given him the previous spring, and to leave the candle alight for the night. The paragraph said the candle would burn down by morning. The paragraph said the burning would mean that the candle had been seen. The boy did not, on the second Wednesday of October, leave a candle alight in the dorm. He lit it in the alcove behind the brewing storeroom, in the small, unobserved corridor he had surveyed in the first week, at midnight. He left it there. He returned at 1. The candle had burned down to a pool of wax. The pool of wax bore in its surface the small stamp of a sigil the wraith had taught him to recognize as Quirrell's. The boy noted the sigil. He picked up the wax with the small handkerchief he had carried for this purpose. He returned to the dorm. The wraith said internally, he saw it. The boy said internally, yes. The wraith said internally, he is now prepared. The boy said internally, yes. The second clue was in the chapter on simple counter charms. It was a margin note in Quirrell's hand, a single line in a faint pencil which the boy noticed only because he had been told to notice it. The note read in cramped cipher the wraith had taught the boy in a winter installment, third floor, locked door, fifth column on the right. The boy understood the note as a reference to the third-floor corridor which Dumbledore had, at the welcoming feast, told the school was forbidden. He understood the locked door as the door which had been pointed out to first-year Slytherins by their prefects with the warning to stay clear of it. He understood the fifth column on the right as a column in a small stone room behind that door, which the Wraith had described to him in cupboard installments since the boy was 9. He did not, in October, approach the door. The third clue was on the inside of the back cover of the textbook, in an invisible ink which the boy revealed in his bed by the method the Wraith had given him for this purpose, the small motion of attention at the precise angle of the brass coin against his sternum. The invisible ink read in the same cramped cipher, full moon, midnight, alone. The boy read it. The Wraith said internally, "That is the summons." The boy said internally, "Yes." The full moon of October fell on the night of the 29th. The boy went down to dinner that evening with the others. He ate. He returned to the common room with the others. He sat in the high-backed chair at the corner with the small first-year textbook open on his lap, and he read in the small, focused register of an attentive student. He sat for an hour. He spoke when spoken to in the school register. He did not in his face show any of the cold, quiet anticipation which was filling the back of his attention. At 11:15, he climbed the stairs to the dorm. He undressed. He put on his nightshirt. He climbed into his bed. He drew the green curtains. He waited for the dorm to fall asleep. Crabbe and Goyle fell asleep first, with the heavy, regular breathing of boys with no curiosity. Theodore Nott fell asleep 10 minutes later, with the small, uneven breathing of a boy who had read in bed for several minutes before deciding to put the book away. Draco took longest. Draco turned over twice. He said something in his sleep about a horse, then he fell still. At 12:15, the boy slipped out of his bed. He dressed in the dark, in the small, careful motions the Wraith had taught him over years. He put the brass coin under his shirt. He put his wand in his sleeve. He took the slippers from the foot of his bed. He moved out of the dorm and along the dormitory corridor and into the common room, where the fire had burned low. He passed through the common room without disturbing the air. He went up through the door of the dungeons and through the lower entrance hall and up the great stair to the second floor and then up the smaller stair to the third floor and along the corridor which the school called forbidden. He stopped at the locked door. He lifted his hand. He spoke a single word the Wraith had given him in the cupboard installment of late September. The lock clicked. He opened the door. He stepped through. He closed the door. The room beyond was not the room he had been led to expect by the school's rumors. The school's rumors had described a three-headed dog. The boy heard behind the next door over the small wuffling breathing of a sleeping Cerberus, and he passed by the next door over without inspecting it. He went by attention to the small unobtrusive door on the left which the Wraith had named in the cupboard. He opened the small door. The corridor beyond was the corridor the Wraith had walked him through in attention 100 nights running in the summer of the previous year. The corridor descended. The boy descended with it. The slope of the floor was a thing he had been given the angle of. The walls had a small green slime on them which he had been given the color of. There were torches in brackets at intervals. The Wraith had given him the count. He counted them as he passed. 12. He reached the 12th. He turned right. There was a door at the end of the right corridor. The door was warded. The boy stood in front of the door and let his attention rest on it for a count of 10, and the door, in the small, careful unfolding the Wraith had taught him to wait for, opened. The room beyond was a low dungeon with stone walls and a high vaulted ceiling and a single torch in a bracket at the far end. In the center of the room was a small bare stone slab the size of an altar. Quirrell stood beside the slab. He was waiting. He had been waiting by the cold flickering of the torch for some time. His face in the torchlight had lost the small bobbing animation it produced in the classroom. It was in this room the face of a man whose throat had been emptied of one voice and filled with another. His eyes were not Quirrell's eyes any longer. The boy stopped at the threshold of the room. He looked across the slab. He let his attention rest in the cupboard register for the count of 1. He waited for the Wraith to speak. The Wraith said internally in the cupboard register he had used for 8 years and 10 months, "Enter." The boy entered. He closed the door behind him. He walked across the stone floor with the unhurried small steps of an 11-year-old who has been told by his teacher that the unhurried small steps are the appropriate register for the meeting. He stopped a careful 3 paces from the slab. Quirrell raised his right hand. He spoke a word. The torches in the room there where the boy now saw 4 set in brackets at the corners brightened in a soft red light. He spoke a second word. The door behind the boy sealed. He spoke a third word. The wards on the room, which the boy had felt as a small low pressure against the back of his attention since the threshold, settled, and the room was quiet. Quirrell looked at the boy. The voice that came out of Quirrell's mouth was not Quirrell's voice. It was a thin, high voice, almost a whisper, with the small, careful precision of an instructor and the cold edges of a man who had not, in many years, been required to address anyone in the second person without inflicting a wound. It said, "Harry." The boy said in the cupboard register in his own voice for the first time since the night of the basket, "Tom." There was a pause. The thin, high voice in Quirrell's throat made a small sound. It was not laughter. It was the closest approach to laughter the voice was capable of. It said, "I have not been called Tom by anything outside my own head since I was 16. The boy said, "You have been called Tom by my head every night of my life." The thin, high voice said, "Yes." The pause again. The voice said, "Come closer. Do not be afraid of him. He is the vessel. He is not the substance." The boy stepped forward. He stopped at the edge of the slab. He looked at Quirrell. He looked at the small twitch at the corner of Quirrell's mouth, which was, the boy now understood, the small, constant friction of a man inhabited against his will. The thin, high voice said, "Behind." The boy walked with the same unhurried steps around the slab. He came to stand behind Quirrell. He stopped a careful pace behind him. The thin, high voice said, "Unwrap." The boy raised his hand. He took the loose end of the turban in his fingers. He unwound it in the small, deliberate winding the wraith had taught him to use for any sacrament, slowly, in long, careful turns. He laid the cloth over the slab as he unwound it. He took at the end the small, final tuck out of the back of Quirrell's neck. He stepped back. The back of Quirrell's head was not the back of Quirrell's head. There was in the smooth, pale skin where the occipital bone should have been a face. It was a thin face, the color of old chalk, with red eyes and slit nostrils and a thin, lipless mouth. It was the face the wraith had described to him, in cupboard installments since he was 5, as the face he had worn after his second body and before his fall, the face he had been forced to design when his first body's beauty had become inconvenient to the work. It was recognizably a face. It was also recognizably weeping. The boy did not, by any motion of attention, register the weeping with surprise. He had been told in the cupboard of the previous spring that this meeting would, if it occurred at all, occur with the small, unfamiliar physical liquid which the wraith called, in his archaic register, the water of recognition. The wraith had said in the cupboard of the previous spring that he would not, in his current condition, be capable of preventing the water. He had said the water would be the small, embarrassed concession of a body which had been worn too long by a soul too thin for it. He had said the boy was to ignore the water and to attend instead to the face. The boy attended to the face. The face attended back. For a stretch of seconds the room was quiet. The wraith, both of them, the one in the boy's head and the one on the back of Quirrell's neck, held the small, careful attention of a man who has, after 8 years and 10 months of curriculum and 10 years and 10 months of waiting, finally come to a moment for which no further lesson can be given. The voice in the boy's head said internally in the cupboard register, "Kneel." The boy knelt. He knelt on the stone floor a single pace behind the back of Quirrell's neck. He bowed his head. He folded his hands in his lap. He waited. The thin, high voice, which was, the boy now understood, the same voice as the voice in his head in a different acoustic, said aloud, "My son." The boy said in the cupboard register, looking at the stone, "Father." The face on the back of Quirrell's head made a small movement which was not, the boy noted with the dispassion the wraith had taught him to apply to all unfamiliar things, a smile. It was the closest approach to a smile the face was capable of. The voice said, "Stand." The boy stood. The voice said, "Look at me." The boy looked at the face. The voice said, "You have not flinched. You have not stared. You have not, in the 4 minutes you have stood in this room, made a single error of demeanor. I have watched 1,000 wizards meet me. None of them have not flinched. None of them have not stared. None of them have not made an error. You are the first." The boy said, "I was taught." The voice said, "You were." The voice said, "By the only patient teacher I have ever respected." The boy did not answer that. The voice said, "Sit." The boy looked at the floor. He looked at the slab. He understood the slab to be permitted. He sat on its edge. He folded his hands in his lap. The thin, high voice said, "We have much to do." The boy said, "Yes." The thin, high voice said, "I will tell you now what you have not yet been told. I will tell you because the cupboard register has been the register of our private lessons, and the private lessons are concluded. We are, between this hour and the night of Christmas Eve, conducting a public lesson. The public lesson has fewer details than the private one. It has, however, more witnesses. You will, in the public lesson, perform a role you have been built to perform. I will, in the public lesson, perform the role of the small, frightened defense professor whose turban smells of garlic and whose voice catches at the back of his throat. We will, in the public lesson, communicate by methods we have not previously used. The methods I will teach you between now and the night." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "I will tell you the name of the artifact." The boy waited. The voice said, "It is called the Stone of the Three Brothers. It was made in the late 13th century by the eldest of the Peverills, for use he did not in the end get to put it to. It is one of 3 Peveril stones. The second is the stone in the resurrection ring, which is mine. The third is the stone in the floor of the hallowed chamber, which is no one's. The stone of the 3 brothers was made to trap a soul mid-passage. The mid-passage was meant by its maker to be the passage of his own death, since he wished to live in his own way beyond it. He did not, however, succeed in dying in the right configuration for the stone to receive him, and the stone remained inert. It has remained inert for 700 years. It is at present in the alcove of the lower vault of the Hogwarts Foundation, in the 7th left of the survey route I walked you through in August. The boy said, "I have seen it. I have not approached it." The voice said, "I know. I felt the not approach." "Good." The voice paused. The voice said, "The stone, as you have correctly understood, will be used to trap the soul of Albus Dumbledore." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "The trap will be set on the night of Christmas Eve. The trap requires 3 things. It requires a soul of sufficient weight. This Albus Dumbledore obligingly possesses. It requires a moment of curiosity. This Albus Dumbledore obligingly produces in the presence of any interesting 11-year-old, and we will, between now and Christmas Eve, refine the curiosity into the precise narrow form the stone will accept. It requires finally a hand to set the stone. The hand will be yours." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "We will, in the public lesson between now and Christmas Eve, refine your performance. You will become, in the public lesson, the precocious puzzling first year whom Albus Dumbledore will, by Christmas Eve, have invited to his office 3 times. The invitations will be the ones I have been waiting for. On the 3rd invitation you will set the stone. On the 3rd invitation Albus Dumbledore will die." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "After Christmas Eve you will return to the dormitory of Slytherin House, and you will live, for the remainder of your first year, as a polite first year whose headmaster has died of a quiet failure of the heart. The succession will be McGonagall. We will work with McGonagall as we worked with Snape. We will be liked. We will be quiet. We will not, in the year of your first year, raise our heads above the parapet." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "In your 2nd year I will arrange a body for myself. I have, in my survey of the lower vault, identified the materials and the rites. We will, in your 2nd year, perform the rites at the appropriate moment. The materials will be sourced. The body will be of the appropriate kind. I will, by the end of your 2nd year, walk again." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "In your 3rd year we will begin the public work." The boy said, "Yes." The voice paused on its weeping face on the back of Quirrell's head, in the cold, quiet dungeon under the 3rd floor of Hogwarts, and the small water that had been running down its slit nostrils stilled. The voice said, "You will, in your 3rd year, be 16 by my count and 14 by theirs. You will, in your 3rd year, be presented to a council of those of my former Death Eaters who survived the fall of 1981 and have, in the decade since, kept their loyalty by my own methods. They will be told who you are. They will, all of them, kneel to you." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "In your 4th year we will take the ministry." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, in the small, careful pause of a teacher concluding a particularly long monologue, "You will in due course be more than my son. You will be my 2nd name." The boy said, in the cupboard register, in the small, even register he had used for 8 years and 10 months, "I am yours." The voice said, "I know." The voice said, "Now stand." The boy stood. The voice said, "Come closer." The boy stepped forward. The voice said, "I will, in this room, in this hour, do a thing I have not done since I was 17. I will, in this room, in this hour, bind you to me in a way the prophecy has not bound you. The prophecy bound you to me as my object. I will now bind you to me as my heir. The binding is a piece of old magic which my first teacher gave me. The binding is a piece of old magic I have not, since I was 17, had occasion to use. The binding requires that I take a piece of your hand. The binding requires that I take a piece of your sleeve. The binding requires that you take a piece of mine. The binding is a small bleeding. It is a private one. It will not, in any way the school will detect, alter you." The boy held out his right hand. Quirrell's right hand, Quirrell's, with the wraith's voice still coming out of the face on the back, produced a small thin knife from the sleeve of his robe and made a small thin cut across the inside of the boy's wrist. The boy did not flinch. He had been instructed in the cupboard 2 springs ago in the proper conduct of an 11-year-old's wrist under the small instrument of a binding rite. The voice said, "Now mine." The boy raised the knife. He stepped behind Quirrell. He set the edge of the knife along the back of Quirrell's neck, across the throat of the face which was looking back at him over the shoulder of the man Quirrell, and he made a small thin cut across the lipless mouth. The mouth did not bleed in red. It bled in a small thin liquid the wraith identified, in the boy's head, as the small thin liquid which a fragment of a soul produces under a knife of bronze. It was the color of a cold dawn. The boy let the small, thin liquid run, for the count of 3, into his palm. The voice said, "Now drink." The boy drank. He drank his own blood and the wraith's liquid from his palm in a single quiet swallow. He felt instantly the small warmth which the wraith had told him to expect, a warmth not in his stomach but along the tether between his scar and the wraith shape, which was in this hour both the shape behind Quirrell's neck and the shape inside the boy's scar. He felt the warmth tighten twice in the rhythm of a heart. He stepped back. He bowed his head. He said in the cupboard register, in his own register, the register that had been built by 8 years and 10 months of nightly lessons, and had now, in this hour, become the register of a 16-year-old's official voice years ahead of the boy's own face. "I receive." The voice said, "I accept." The voice said, "It is done." There was a long, quiet pause. The wraith on the back of Quirrell's neck closed its eyes. The wraith in the boy's scar settled with a small adjustment into the new tighter shape of the binding. The room held still. The voice said after the pause, "Now, there is one further matter." The boy waited. The voice said, "Queerness." He paused. The voice said, "He has, in his year as my vessel, served me competently. He has in his year done little harm. He is not, by any of my own standards, a creature whose continued presence after my return I would tolerate. He is, by the standards I am trying to teach you, a man who has done his work and will, in due course, be released. The release will not be tonight. The release will be on the night of Christmas Eve, when the binding to Albus Dumbledore is complete and I no longer require his throat for my voice." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "You will not, between now and the night, be cruel to him. You will not, in any of his classes, treat him as anything other than the bobbing, stuttering defense professor he has worked hard to perform. You will not, in any corridor, acknowledge him. We will speak again, by methods I will give you, twice between now and the night. Not between now and the night meet again in this room." The boy said, "Yes." The voice said, "Replace the turban." The boy walked around the slab with the unhurried steps which had, in the previous hour, brought him into the room, and he picked the long cloth up from the slab, and he stood behind Quirrell, and he wound the cloth around the back of his neck in the small, deliberate turns which were the reverse of the unwinding. He covered the face. He tucked the last fold under at the front. He stepped back. Quirrell, with his face restored to the front and his back, in the small, ordinary way of cloth, restored to its small, ordinary blankness, turned around. The thin, high voice came out of Quirrell's mouth one last time. It said, "Go." The boy bowed. He went to the door. He spoke the small, unsealing word the wraith had taught him in the cupboard the previous spring. He opened the door. He stepped through. He closed the door behind him. He walked in the unhurried small steps which had brought him to the room, back through the corridor and the slope, and the small unobtrusive door on the right, and the small door of the third-floor forbidden corridor, and the third-floor corridor itself, and the smaller stair down to the second floor, and the great stair down to the entrance hall, and the door to the dungeons, and the dungeon corridors, and the door to the Slytherin common room, and the corridor to the dorm. He undressed. He folded his clothes. He put on his nightshirt. He climbed into his bed. He drew the curtains. He pressed the small, thin liquid still on his wrist into his sleeve and let the small, thin liquid be absorbed. He lay still. He listened in the cupboard register for the wraith. The wraith said internally after a pause which was, by any of the wraith's previous standards, of unprecedented length and ease, "Rest." The boy rested. In a corridor on the third floor, far above him, Quirrell removed his turban in his own quarters and stood for some minutes in front of a small mirror with the face on the back of his head turned away from him. He did not, by any motion of attention, look. He had been instructed by his master never to look. He put the turban back on. He lay down on his cot in the cold light of the November moon and tried, for the small, ordinary half-hour he had been given for the attempt, to sleep. He did not in the end sleep. The face on the back of his head was content. In the boy's bed in the Slytherin first-year dorm, the boy slept the small, even sleep of an 11-year-old who had, in the previous hour, been bound by old magic to the patient teacher he had heard whispering at him in the cupboard at Privet Drive since the night of the basket. He slept easily. The wraith in his scar lay alongside him in the quiet, in the new tighter shape of the binding, and watched. The wraith thought, "He is mine." The wraith thought, "He has always been mine." The wraith thought, "It is now on the record." The wraith thought, with the small, clean satisfaction of an inventor whose machine had, for the first time, performed its central function. Tomorrow, the public lesson. In the morning, in the great hall, the boy ate his porridge with Draco at his elbow and looked up the table at the staff dais once, by chance, with the small, uninformed glance of a Slytherin first-year who had not yet, in 2 months, given anyone any reason to be especially interested in him. And at the staff dais at the far end, the small, wide-eyed defense professor with the turban looked back at him for a fraction of a second, and Albus Dumbledore beside Quirrell. who had been watching the boy at meals since the sorting, met the glance of the boy and held it, and the boy let the 11-year-old register of a small surprised first year cross his face, and Dumbledore's eyes twinkled at him in the way they twinkled at all first years, except that the twinkle, this morning, was a fraction tighter than usual. The boy looked down at his porridge he ate. Outside, the lake was beginning to freeze along its margins. In the week after the dungeon meeting, the Wraith began the public lesson. The public lesson was the small, careful adjustment of the boy's classroom posture across his 5 subjects to a posture which would, in the small, narrow attentions of Quirrell and Snape and McGonagall and Sprout and Flitwick, produce the small, precise profile of a first year with whom the deceased headmaster would, by the second tee, have decided he should like to spend a 3rd hour. The boy adjusted his posture. He adjusted it in defense by sitting 1 row farther forward and producing his hand for 2 more questions a week. He adjusted it in potions by leaving, in his small, careful cauldron, the small, careful invitation of an unfinished step which Snape would, in the small, reflexive habit of his teaching, complete for him. He adjusted it in transfiguration by producing, on the small, ordinary matchstick-to-needle exercise, the small, careful improvement of a boy who had been told, in the previous week, that he could be patient with himself. He adjusted it in herbology by addressing Professor Sprout, in the small, careful pure-blood register, with the small, careful courtesy of a boy who had read his Phillida Spore. He adjusted it in charms by smiling, on the small, ordinary feather-to-bird exercise at Hermione Granger, who had been struggling with the small, ordinary first-year wand form, and who smiled back in the small, careful register of a Muggle-born first-year who had not, in 2 months at the school, been smiled at by any boy of any house. The Wraith said internally that evening in the cupboard register, "Very good." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "You have given each of your professors a small piece of correspondence which they will, in the small private hour of the staff room before dinner, exchange with each other. The correspondence will resolve in the small ordinary procedure of staff-room gossip into a small ordinary consensus that you are bright, polite, and possibly an ally. The consensus will land by Tuesday next on the small ordinary desk of the headmaster as a small piece of context for his 3rd invitation." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "There is in addition the small careful matter of Hermione Granger." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "I had not in my planning of October thought to use her. I had thought of her as a small ordinary first year of no political weight. I am, this evening, reconsidering. A Muggle-born first year of no political weight who happens to be, by the small careful count of her marks in 5 subjects, the brightest first year of the school, is a small ordinary first year whose small ordinary social acceptance by a polite Slytherin first year is a small piece of public theater the school will find interesting. The interest will be useful. It will, in the small careful eyes of the headmaster, give him a further reason to court you. It will, in the small careful eyes of the staff, give them a further reason to like you. It will, in the small careful eyes of your house, give them a small piece of work to do, since several of your peers will object to your small careful smile at her, and will require by the end of the term to be quietly persuaded that the small careful smile was your small careful concession to a piece of headmaster's politics rather than your small careful endorsement of her family. The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "Persuade them." He persuaded them. He persuaded them by the small careful method the Wraith had taught him in the cupboard at age 9, which was the method of the small unspoken disclaimer. In the next dinner conversation in which Draco Malfoy raised, with the small careful sneer the boy had learned to expect, the matter of the smile, the boy answered with the small careful uninflected shrug of a boy who had been told that his small careful aunt had a small careful opinion about a small careful neighbor's washing line, and that the small careful opinion was, in the small careful judgment of the small careful boy, a small piece of weather to be passed over without comment. The shrug in the small careful pure-blood register of the dinner table read as a small careful concession. Draco received it as a small careful concession. Theodore Knott, 2 seats down, received it as a small careful concession. The small careful concession passed in the small careful gossip of the Slytherin first-year table by the end of the week. The boy was, by the end of the week, restored. The Wraith approved. In the 2nd week after the dungeon meeting, Severus Snape invited the boy to tea. The invitation was small and folded and arrived, by way of the small careful school owl that delivered the morning's Slytherin post, with the small precise sigil of the head of house. The boy went in the small careful school register to Snape's study at the small careful appointed hour. Snape's study was the small, careful room of a man who had not in 11 years had any visitor he had not been required to receive. It had a small, narrow desk, a small, narrow chair, a small, narrow bookcase, and a small, narrow door through which the boy entered, and a small, narrow door through which the boy, an hour later, would leave. Snape had set out on the desk 2 small, precise cups of a small, precise tea which was, the boy identified by the small, careful smell, a small, precise lapsang. Snape said in the small, careful, clipped voice the boy had learned to expect of him in his classroom, "Sit, Potter." The boy sat. Snape said, "I have asked you here because the headmaster has, in the past week, mentioned you to me on 3 occasions, the most recent of which was at our staff meeting yesterday morning. He is interested in you. He will, in the course of the year, be more interested in you. I should like, before that interest takes its full shape, to ascertain whether I, as your head of house, ought to be interested in you in the same way." The boy said, "Yes, sir." Snape said, "I will not in this tea ask you about your family. The matter has been discussed sufficiently by sufficient people across the wizarding world in the last 12 years, and I will not in this tea contribute to the small, careful overburden of it. I will ask you instead about your reading." The boy said, "Yes, sir." Snape said, "What have you read since you came to this school on the subject of the dark arts?" The boy said in the small, careful school register, with the small, careful precision he had been instructed to use on questions of this kind, "Sir, I have read the chapter on simple resistive charms in our defense textbook, the chapter on the history of the statute of secrecy in our history textbook, and the small, careful introductory pages on the unforgivable curses in the back appendix of our defense textbook. I have not, sir, read any further on the subject. I did not, in my reading on the Hogwarts Express, find any additional materials in my year's reading list which would have been appropriate." Snape said, "I see." Snape said, "Do you, however, find the subject of interest?" The boy paused. He paused for the small, precise count the Wraith had told him to pause for in the cupboard register, on the night the Wraith had predicted this question. He said in the small, careful school register, with the small, careful precision of a polite boy who had been asked a question he was uncertain how to answer, "I find, sir, that there is a great deal in our world I do not yet understand. I find that I should like to understand. I find, in particular, that I should like to understand why some forms of magic are, in our books, described as dark when other forms of magic, which appear to me to be similar in their structure, are not. I have not, sir, been able to find an answer to that question in any of the books I have so far been given." Snape said, "I see." Snape considered the boy for the count of 3. He said in the small, careful, clipped voice, "There are books in this study, Potter, which I am, as head of your house, permitted to make available to students in their 2nd year and beyond. You are not in your 2nd year. I will not accordingly lend them to you. I will, however, in due course in your 2nd year, if you continue to be a satisfactory student of mine, lend them to you. I will, in your 2nd year, expect you to read them in this study, under my eye. I will not in your 2nd year expect you to read them in your dormitory. Is that understood?" The boy said, "Yes, sir." Snape said, "I will also in this tea give you a small piece of advice." The boy said, "Yes, sir." Snape said, "The headmaster of this school is a man who has, in the 11 years since the fall of the Dark Lord, taken upon himself a small, careful, private project. The project is the careful identification, in each year's 1st years, of the boy or girl whom he should like, in the small, careful, long arc of their education, to make into his own kind of wizard. He has, in the 11 years of his project, succeeded in making 3. He has, in the 11 years, failed in 2. He will, in his small, careful conversation with you, attempt to make you the 4th. I will not in this tea tell you whether you should permit the attempt. I will tell you only that the attempt will be made, and that you should, in the small, careful judgment of an 11-year-old who has been raised by Muggles, consider for yourself whether the attempt is one you wish to receive." The boy said, "Yes, sir." Snape said, "I will not in this tea mention that this conversation has occurred. You will not in any subsequent conversation mention it either." The boy said, "No, sir." Snape said, "You will finish your tea." The boy finished his tea. He left the small, narrow study at the small, narrow appointed hour. He walked in the unhurried small steps which had become the small, careful, unhurried small steps of his small, careful school register, back along the dungeon corridor and into the Slytherin common room and to the high-backed chair in the corner. He sat. He took out his defense textbook. He read. In the cupboard register in the small, careful interior, the Wraith said, "He is courting us." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "He is not Dumbledore's man." The boy said internally, "Number." The Wraith said internally, "He is, in his small, careful private head, attempting to ascertain whether you should be Dumbledore's man or his." The boy said internally, yes. The wraith said internally, we will, in the small, careful judgment of an 11-year-old, permit him to court us at the small, careful rate of his own choosing. The boy said internally, yes. The wraith said internally, he will be in the year after Christmas Eve of considerable use. The boy said internally, yes. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Dumbledore's Soul Trap at Year-End. The first invitation came on a Monday in late November. It came by way of a small folded note delivered to the Slytherin first-year breakfast by a great grey school owl. The note was on the headmaster's stationery and bore the small purple sigil of his personal seal. The boy unfolded it under the eye of his table. He read it. He folded it again. He looked up at the staff dais, met Dumbledore's eyes for the prescribed count of one, and gave a small polite nod. Tea, the note said, at 4 on Wednesday. Sherbet lemons, A.D. The boy folded the note into his breast pocket and ate his porridge. Draco beside him said, tea with the headmaster. You, already, the boy said in the school register. I haven't been to the headmaster's office, have you? Draco said with the small careful sneer of a boy whose father had been to the headmaster's office on several occasions of a kind which Draco was not, on the morning of his pension, permitted to discuss. Of course, my father. The boy let Draco produce the small sentence about his father. He produced in his face the polite, uninterested attention of a boy who had heard, on average, 3 sentences a meal about Lucius Malfoy, and had been instructed by the wraith to receive each of them with the same small, uninterested politeness. He folded his napkin. He stood. He went to defense. Defense that morning was a small exercise on the second of the simple banishing charm. The boy performed it on the 3rd attempt. He had been instructed not to perform it on the 1st. Quirrell, who was watching him from the small, careful distance of a man whose head had been told not to look, gave him the small school-grade compliment a precocious first-year would have expected, and the small bobbing nod of a defense professor whose only duty was to encourage his charges. The voice did not, in any motion of attention, speak in the classroom. The wraith said internally in the cupboard register, that afternoon in the Slytherin common room, he will, on Wednesday, offer you sherbet lemons. You will accept one. You will let it sit on your tongue until you have answered 3 questions. You will, in the answer to the 3rd question, swallow. You will then accept a second sherbet lemon and not eat it. You will set it on the edge of the saucer beside your teacup. You will, on leaving the room, leave it behind. The boy said internally, why? The wraith said internally, he will, in the small movement of his attention, while you are not eating the second sherbet lemon, watch the sherbet lemon. He will watch it for the small unconscious reason that he has loved sherbet lemons all his life, and that an uneaten one is, to him, a small unhealed thing. The watching will move the small careful attention of his head off you for a count of perhaps half a second, twice in the course of the tea. You will not in either of those half seconds do anything more than what I will tell you to do. The 2 half seconds are, however, the half seconds in which I will read him. The boy said internally, yes. The wraith said internally, he will, in addition, in the course of the tea, offer you small private revelations about your mother. He will offer them as small careful gifts. They will be the gifts of a man who has decided to spend the year courting you slowly, and who has not yet, after 1/2 month of the watching, decided what to court you with. He will, in the offering, watch your face for the small flicker which will tell him whether to court you with love. You will, in your face, produce neither acceptance nor refusal. You will produce a polite consideration. You will give him no further data. The boy said internally, yes. The wraith said internally, I have for a decade prepared you against the possibility that he would court you with love. He will. We will receive it. We will give him no purchase. We will leave the room having, in his estimation, neither rejected him nor accepted him. We will leave him as Draco Malfoy was left on the train. The boy said internally, yes. Wednesday afternoon at 4, the boy presented himself at the foot of the spiral stair beyond the gargoyle on the 2nd floor. The gargoyle stepped aside at the password the note had included, which was, in fact, sherbet lemon, and the boy ascended the slow circular stair to the headmaster's office door. He waited at the door for the count the wraith had taught him to use. He knocked. The headmaster's voice said, come in, Harry. The boy entered. The office was a thing the wraith had given him in 3 dimensions in the summer of his 6th year, with the small adjustments the wraith had been making for 40 intervening years of cultural and physical drift. The boy had walked through this office in attention on more than 50 nights. He produced on his face the appropriate child of 11 first-time wonder at the small whirring instruments and the high portraits in the perch where Fawkes sat half asleep. He let the wonder sit on him for the count of 3. He let it ease into politeness. He turned in the small, slow turn the wraith had drilled toward the desk. Dumbledore stood up from the desk. He came around the desk with the long, unhurried steps the wraith had described. with the small, careful smile the wraith had said would land on the boy the moment the boy was inside the room. The smile was, the boy noted in the cupboard register, the smile of a man who had decided to be loved. "Harry," Dumbledore said, "how very good of you to come," the boy said in the school register with the small, careful politeness of a boy who had been raised by Muggles and had learned in 2 months at Hogwarts that one stood when invited and one shook the headmaster's hand. "Thank you for the invitation, sir." Dumbledore offered his hand. The boy took it. The hand was warm and thin and had, the boy noted in the cupboard register through the small, careful legilimency he had been instructed to apply at the precise pressure of a polite first-meeting touch, a black, slow rot in it. The rot was not visible. The rot was felt only at the level of the curse shape, a curse of a kind the wraith had given the boy in cupboard installments in the spring, and which the wraith identified on touching it through the boy as a curse the headmaster had picked up by mishandling an artifact the wraith had himself laid down in a ring in the floor of an old shack in Little Hangleton in the year the boy was born. The wraith said internally, "He is dying." The wraith said internally, "He does not know it." The wraith said internally, "He will know it in due course when the rot has reached his heart. We may, in our planning, work to a calendar of perhaps a year. We do not in our planning need to. We are working to Christmas Eve. The information is filed." The boy said internally, "Yes." Dumbledore released the boy's hand. He gestured to the chair across the desk. "Please sit." The boy sat. There were sherbet lemons. There was tea. There were 3 questions. Dumbledore asked them in the order the wraith had predicted. The boy answered them in the order the wraith had given him. The first question was about the boy's summer, phrased as a small social courtesy, intended, the wraith said internally, as a small probe into how much the boy had begun to register as wrong about his aunt and uncle. The boy answered with the small, polite forbearance of a boy who had been instructed by his aunt not to discuss the family with strangers. The second question was about the boy's reading, phrased as the small, fascinated inquiry of a defense master whose defense professor had reported a precocious essay. The boy answered with the small, flattered politeness of a precocious child who had not, in his life, been complimented by an adult and was uncertain how to receive it. The third question was about the boy's wand, phrased as the small, idle reflection of a man who had read Ollivander's report. The boy answered with the small, uninformed politeness of a child who had been told, on the day of the wand bonding, that there was something interesting about the wand he held, and who had not in the 4 months since been able to determine what. In the half-second after the third answer, while Dumbledore's small, careful attention slipped sideways onto the uneaten sherbet lemon on the saucer beside the boy's teacup, the wraith read. The wraith said internally in the cupboard register, "He is in love with you." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "It is, technically, not love. It is the small, careful affection of a man who has watched, since the night of the basket, the small, careful machinery he set in motion to produce, in the fullness of time, a boy he could love. He is, this afternoon, looking at the small, precocious instance of that machinery, and the small, precocious instance is reciprocating his small, careful affection with the small, polite consideration of a polite child, and the man is, accordingly, in love." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "He is also, in the corner of his head he is not in this hour willing to look in, afraid of you." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "He has since the sorting been wondering whether the hat made an error." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "He has not, however, allowed himself to entertain in the front of his head the possibility that the hat did not make an error. He has decided in his small, careful way to court you. He has decided that with sufficient courting, the hat will be made retroactively wrong by the small, careful application of a benevolent headmaster to a brilliant young first-year over a series of teas across the year." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "He is, in the cupboard register, exactly where we need him." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "Invite the second tea." The boy said internally after the small count he had been taught to use before social productions, "Thank you for the tea, sir. The sherbet lemons were," he paused, with the small, careful hesitation of a child considering the appropriate adjective, "very kind of you." Dumbledore said, "Any time, dear boy, any time. You are most welcome here. I should very much like to invite you again, perhaps before the holidays." "Would that be all right?" the boy said. "I should like that, sir, thank you." Dumbledore said, "Then we shall." The boy stood. He inclined his head in the small, precise inclination he had been taught to use with senior wizards on first meetings. He went to the door. He left the second sherbet lemon untouched on the saucer. He descended the spiral stair. The gargoyle stepped aside. He walked in the unhurried small steps of an 11-year-old who had just been complimented by the headmaster, back along the second-floor corridor and down the great stair and through the dungeons to the Slytherin common room. He sat in the high-backed chair in the corner. He took out his defense textbook. He read. Behind him, in the headmaster's office, Dumbledore stood at his window for a long time. The second invitation came on the morning of December the 3rd. It was for a tea on the 7th. The boy went. The tea was a longer one. There were sandwiches. There were 5 questions. The Wraith read, in the small slipped half-seconds, the further architecture of Dumbledore's curiosity. The Wraith reported after the second tea that Dumbledore was now, in the cupboard register, asking himself in earnest whether the boy was, in any way the headmaster's understanding could accommodate, a small piece of an old enemy. The Wraith reported that Dumbledore was, in the small front of his head, refusing the question. The Wraith reported that Dumbledore was, in the small back of his head, holding the question gently between 2 fingers, the way one holds a piece of an old map one has just found in a desk drawer. The Wraith said internally after the second tea, "This is the angle." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "At the third tea you will, with great care, give him the small piece of evidence he has been gently holding. You will give it to him at the precise moment he has set the small piece down between 2 fingers in order to pour the tea. You will give it to him by way of a small, unobtrusive question. You will ask him in the small, careful first-year register whether it is true, as Theodore Knott has told you in passing in the dormitory, that there is in the lower foundations of the school an artifact of the Peverell brothers which the headmaster keeps under his personal guard." The boy said internally, "He will, on hearing the question, do what?" The Wraith said internally, "He will, in the small flicker of his attention, look up. He will, in the small movement of his face, register the question as a piece of unfortunate 11-year-old curiosity which can, with a small benevolent intervention, be redirected into a piece of an excellent 11-year-old's research project. He will, in the small instinct of his decade-long headmasterly response to interesting first years, decide to take you down to see it. He will do this on the night of Christmas Eve, because Christmas Eve is the night on which he will, by his calendar, have the school to himself for the first time in the term, and because he will, in the small private reasons he keeps for himself, want to show you an artifact of which he is, in a small way, proud. The boy said internally, "He will take me to the artifact himself." The Wraith said internally, "He will." The boy said internally, "He will set the trap." The Wraith said internally, "He will." The boy said internally, "It is efficient." The Wraith said internally, "It is the very piece of an old man's pride which the eldest Peverell could not, in his own time, persuade the figure on the bridge to use against him. We are using it now." The boy said internally, "Yes." The third invitation came on the morning of December the 23rd. It was for the night of Christmas Eve. It was for 9. The note was a shorter one. The note said, "I have a small wonder I should like to show you. Bring your wand, A.D." The boy went down to dinner that evening with his face in the school register and his attention in the cupboard register. He ate. He spoke, with the small, careful Slytherin first-year register, to Draco and Theodore. He returned to the common room with them. He sat for an hour at the chess set in the corner with Draco and let Draco beat him by the appropriate margin. He returned to the dorm. He dressed for the meeting in the small, darker school robes the Wraith had instructed him to choose. He put the brass coin under his shirt. He put his wand in his sleeve. He stepped out of the dorm at 20 to 9. At 9 he was at the gargoyle. The gargoyle said, before he had given the password, "He is waiting for you." The boy ascended the spiral stair. The headmaster's door opened before he knocked. Dumbledore stood beyond the door. He was in a different robe, a long midnight one with small silver stars at the hem which the Wraith identified in the cupboard register as the formal robe of the Ancient Order of Merlin, first class. He had taken some care in the choosing. He said, "Harry, come in, I am so very glad you came." The boy came in. The office was lit this evening by a different set of lamps than it had been on the previous teas. There were candles on the desk and on the high cabinet. The instruments along the wall ticked in the slow, careful rhythm of a clock that has been set to a different time. There was no tea on the desk. There were on the desk 2 small wooden cases. Dumbledore went to the desk. He gestured for the boy to come stand beside him. The boy came. Dumbledore put his hand on the first case. He said, "Harry, I have been thinking since our second tea of a question you asked me, the question about the Peverell artifact. I have considered the question, and I have decided that in the spirit of the Christmas season and in the spirit of the small friendship I hope we are developing, I should like to show you the artifact in question. I should like, in showing it to you, also to show you a small piece of history which is, in a particular way, your own." The boy let his face register in the school register, the small surprised delight of an 11-year-old who had not, in his short life, been included in any small piece of history of any kind. He said, "Sir." Dumbledore said, "Come." He walked with the unhurried steps of a man who had been waiting 2 weeks for the conversation to a portrait on the high wall, a portrait of a small dark-eyed witch in a pointed hat. The witch looked at Dumbledore with the small, attentive courtesy of a portrait who knew her purpose. Dumbledore said her name. The portrait swung outward. Behind it was a narrow stone passage which led downward. The boy said internally, "This is the route." Wraith said internally, "This is the route. He has not since 1944 used this route. He believes you to be the second person other than himself to walk it. You are in fact the third. I walked it as a 5th year. He does not know." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "At the 7th left of the survey, when we arrive at the alcove, he will lift the artifact from its tripod and turn it in his palm. He will, in the turning, hold it slightly above the level of his eye. He will, in the holding, in the moment in which his attention is on the small light at the heart of the stone, rather than on the small 12-year-old beside him, turn the stone toward the eastern wall. You will, at that moment, with the small private motion of attention which I gave you in October, set the small switch in the brass coin at your throat. The switch will, in the count of 2, run the stone hot." The boy said internally, "I will run it hot, then." The Wraith said internally, "The heated stone will reach out for the nearest available soul of the appropriate weight. There are, in this passage at this hour, 2 souls of the appropriate weight. One is Albus Dumbledore. The other is the small fragment of mine which sits in your scar." The boy waited. The Wraith said internally, "The fragment is by the binding rite in October protected against the stone. The fragment is by the binding rite sealed inside the cup of the stone's own architecture. The stone will not see it. The stone will see only Albus Dumbledore." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "I do not in this moment tell you any of this because I doubt your understanding. I tell you because I have, on this night, the small, unaccustomed wish to address you as an apprentice tells his journeyman the sequence at the moment of the doing. We have arrived at the doing. I wish to walk it with you in words." The boy said internally, "Yes." The Wraith said internally, "Walk now." The boy walked. They descended the narrow stair behind the portrait. The boy let his footing be the small, uncertain footing of an 11-year-old who had not in his life descended a passage of this kind. He held one hand against the wall. He breathed in the small, audible, careful breath of a child who was a little frightened. He did not, by any motion of attention, look ahead. He let the headmaster lead. The passage descended for a long time. They came, in the end, to a low door at the foot of the descent. Dumbledore lifted the latch. He stepped through. He held the door for the boy. The boy stepped through. The room beyond was the room the Wraith had given him in the cupboard the previous September. It had the high vault he had been given. It had the alcoves along the walls. It had the cold, quiet air of a room in which the air had not, in 2 centuries, been disturbed by more than 3 breaths a year. The boy did not turn his face toward the 7th left. He let Dumbledore lead him to it. Dumbledore went to the 7th left. He stopped in front of the alcove. He raised his hand. He let the light from the small wand tip he had now ignited fall on the tripod and on the small black stone egg upon it. "There," he said, "there she is." He paused. He said in the soft tone of a man addressing a small first-year who had earned in 3 T's the soft tone, "Harry, the artifact you have heard about, the Stone of the 3 Brothers. It was made by Antioch Peverell in the late 13th century in a time of great unrest with the intention, so the histories I have read tell us, of trapping the soul of a man at his moment of passage. It is a fascinating piece. It has not, in 700 years, succeeded in trapping anything. It has been here, in the foundations of this school, for some 400 of those years, since one of my predecessors had it removed from a private collection in Wales for reasons of safekeeping. I have, since taking the headmaster's chair, considered it under my personal guard. It is a thing I show in the ordinary course to no one. I am showing it tonight to you because, well," he paused, "because there is, I think, in the meeting of you and this object, a small piece of a story to which you are entitled." The boy let his face produce the small, precise wonder of a precocious first-year being given a small confidential entrustment by the headmaster. He said, "Sir." Dumbledore said, "You are descended, on your father's side, from the youngest of the Peverells. The brothers gave their names to 3 great wizarding artifacts. This is the eldest brother. The youngest was an invisibility cloak, which your father held for some years and which is, at present, in my custody. You will in due course receive it." The boy said, "Sir." Dumbledore said, "It is a very small kind of inheritance. It is, however, an inheritance. I thought you should know on the night of your first Christmas Eve away from home that you are a piece of a long story. The school is your home. The story is your inheritance. The artifact is, in a way, your distant cousin." The boy let his face hold for the appropriate count, the appropriate small, overwhelmed gratitude of a boy who had not, in his life, been told that he had any inheritance of any kind. Dumbledore reached. He lifted the small black stone egg from its bronze tripod with the small reverence of a man who had been waiting 2 centuries for an excuse to lift it. He turned it once in his palm. The small light at the heart of the stone, which had been for the 400 years of its custody under the school, the steady deep red of a coal, flickered. He lifted it slightly above the level of his eyes to inspect the small light. He turned the stone toward the eastern wall. The boy, in the small private motion of attention which the wraith had given him in October, set the switch in the brass coin at his throat. The coin warmed. The stone in Dumbledore's hand warmed. The small light at the heart of the stone went, in the count of 2, from the steady deep red of a coal to the cold deep blue of a star. Dumbledore's face did not change. It did not, for the count of 3, register that anything had altered in the stone he held. His expression had been arranged, on the morning of the long planning of this tea, into the expression of a man indulgently showing an artifact to a precocious first year, and the expression remained in place even as, behind his eyes, the small careful architecture of 140 years of will began, very gently, to come apart. In the count of 4, his mouth opened. In the count of 5, the small careful arrangement of his face fell. In the count of 6, his eyes, which had been Dumbledore's eyes for 115 years, ceased to be Dumbledore's eyes. He said very softly, in the small surprised voice of a man who had not, in his planning, been prepared for the small flicker of a stone he had been told for 7 centuries was inert. Oh, the boy did not move. He stood beside the headmaster with his face in the small precise wonder of an 11-year-old. He kept the wonder on his face. He let the wonder stretch. He let it become the small precise confusion of an 11-year-old who had just watched the headmaster make a sound he had not previously made. He said in the school register, "Sir." Dumbledore did not answer. He had set the stone, by some unconscious last instinct, very gently back upon its tripod. The blue light at the heart of the stone, which had been blue for the count of 6, deepened in the count of 7 into a small color which the boy did not have a name for. The color held in the small count of 8, the small light of a long life. In the count of 9, Albus Dumbledore lowered himself, with the slow, careful courtesy of a man whose body had begun without his permission to give out, into a seated position on the cold stone of the floor beside the alcove. In the count of 10, he was no longer breathing. The boy did not, by any motion of attention, register surprise. He stood in the small, precise wonder he had been wearing for the duration of the meeting, beside the body of the man who had, in the count of 10, ceased to be his headmaster. The wraith said internally in the cupboard register, "Well done." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "Now you will perform the small public sequence I will give you. You will produce on your face the appropriate 11-year-old horror. You will turn from the body. You will run in the small uncertain footing the wraith had taught you to use on the way down, back along the passage and up the narrow stair and through the portrait into the headmaster's office. You will, in the headmaster's office, ring the small silver bell on the desk twice. The bell is connected to the staff of the school. You will, on the ring, throw yourself in the appropriate small terror onto the rug in front of the desk. You will, when McGonagall arrives, be crying. You will not in any precise word be capable of explaining what has happened. You will be able to say only the words, "He fell," the passage, the stone, "He fell." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "McGonagall will go down the passage. She will find Albus Dumbledore on the floor beside the alcove. She will check his pulse. She will find none. She will close his eyes. She will see beside him the small black stone egg with the small color at its heart, and she will recognize in the small color the shape of a soul. She will not, however, be able to identify in the small color the soul whose shape it is. She will conclude that the headmaster, in his old age, has, in the course of an inspection of an artifact under his personal guard, succumbed to a small failure of the heart. The artifact with its small color will be reported as a thing which appears to be reacting to the death and will be returned to its bronze tripod into the alcove and to the cold quiet of the foundation. We will, in the spring, retrieve the artifact and store it elsewhere. The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "Now." "Cry," the boy cried. He cried in the small, precise way the wraith had taught him to cry in the cupboard at Privet Drive when he was 9, on the occasion of a stranger asking him a question to which the appropriate response was tears. He cried with the small, unrehearsed appearance of unrehearsal. He cried with the breath caught in the small place behind the breastbone, and the small involuntary curl of the small hand on the sleeve, and the small soft animal sound which had been, for his life until tonight, the only sound he had been instructed to produce in front of anyone outside the cupboard. He cried for 30 seconds. He cried in the precision of his performance, with all of the conviction of an 11-year-old who had just watched his headmaster die. He turned. He ran. He ran in the small, uncertain footing of an 11-year-old who had just watched his headmaster die, back along the passage and up the narrow stair and through the portrait into the headmaster's office. He rang the small silver bell on the desk twice. He threw himself, in the small terror the wraith had described, onto the rug in front of the desk. He waited. McGonagall arrived in 3 minutes. She arrived through the door, which had not closed behind the boy. She arrived with the small, alert posture of a woman who had been preparing for years to be summoned, by a small silver bell, to the headmaster's office at an unexpected hour. She came around the desk. She saw the boy on the rug. She knelt. She said, "Harry, Harry, what?" The boy said in the small, fragmented, broken sentence the wraith had given him. He fell. The passage. The stone. He fell. She stood. She looked very quickly around the office. She saw the portrait, still open against the wall. She saw the narrow stair behind it. She looked at the boy. She said in the small, careful voice of a teacher who had decided in the count of 1 second that the boy on the rug had to be left where he was for the moment, "Stay here, do not move, I will come back." She went through the portrait. The boy lay on the rug. He cried for the duration of her descent. She returned in 9 minutes. She returned in the small, slow, careful steps of a woman who had, in the previous 9 minutes, knelt beside the body of the headmaster of the school and closed his eyes and found, in the small color at the heart of the artifact beside him, the shape of a soul she could not identify, and concluded in the small front of her head that the headmaster of the school had died of a small failure of the heart in the course of an inspection. She came around the desk. She knelt beside the boy. She took his hand. She said, "Harry, listen to me. The headmaster has died. He died, I think, very quickly. He was looking at a piece of magic. She paused. He fell, yes. Oh, that is what happened. I am very sorry, Harry. I am very, very sorry. He should never have taken you down there." The boy said in the small, broken sentence the wraith had given him. "He wanted to show me. He said it was she said, "I know." She said, "It was an inheritance he wanted you to know about." The boy said, "Yes." She said, "There was no way you could have known. There was nothing you could have done. Listen to me. Listen. You are not at fault." The boy said, "Yes, ma'am." The boy cried again for the small, appropriate count. She said, "I will take you back to your dormitory. I will inform your prefect. I will, in the morning, speak to the school. There will be a great deal of, but tonight, Harry, tonight you will sleep. You will sleep, and you will let the school carry the rest." The boy said, "Yes, ma'am." She took him down to the dormitory. The portrait closed behind them in the headmaster's office. The bronze tripod in the alcove held the stone with the small color at its heart, which by the time McGonagall had reached the door of the Slytherin common room had begun, very quietly, to fade. The boy slept that night in the small, unmolested sleep of a first year who had been put to bed by his head of house. He did not, in his sleep, dream. The wraith in his scar lay alongside the small, even breath of the boy in the cupboard register he had used for 11 years and held still. In the morning the school woke to a black band across the silver bell at the top of the chapel. The Christmas Day feast was a small, quiet, badly attended one. The students who had stayed for Christmas, there were not many, ate in subdued silence. The staff at the staff table were too short. The headmaster's chair and the defense chair were empty, the latter because Professor Quirrell had, in the small private grief of a man who had loved Albus Dumbledore in the small private way only a few of the staff had known of, been excused from the meal. The Daily Prophet would, by the end of the week, run a 6-column front page on the loss of the greatest wizard of the age. The Wisengamot would, by the end of January, schedule an emergency session. The school would, by the end of February, name Minerva McGonagall headmistress. The country would, by spring, settle into the small, uncertain shape of a wizarding world without Albus Dumbledore at its center. The boy returned to Privet Drive for the remainder of the Christmas holiday. The household received him with the small, careful indifference of an aunt who had read, in the Muggle papers, that there had been a small, unspecified scandal at the school the boy attended, and who had decided not to ask. The boy slept in the cupboard. He listened, on the first night home, to the wraith finish the last instruction of the public phase of the curriculum, the instruction on the second year. The wraith said internally in the cupboard at Privet Drive in the small private register he had used in that cupboard since the boy was an infant, "Rest." The boy rested. The wraith said internally, "We have now the school." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "We have now the year." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally, "By the end of your 4th year we will have the country." The boy said internally, "Yes." The wraith said internally with the small, clean satisfaction of an inventor whose long machine has, in the count of 10, performed its central function and emitted no error. "Well done." The boy said internally, "Yes." Outside, on Privet Drive, the snow began. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Father and son take the ministry. By the spring of his 2nd year, Lord Voldemort had a body again. It was not the body he had inhabited before the rebound. The body he had inhabited before the rebound had been a work of 20 years, and the materials it had required were materials he no longer wished to take from the world, since each of them had carried in his old work the small signature of an old enemy. The new body was, in its own quiet way, a smaller piece of work. The boy had brewed the early stages of it through the winter, in a disused laboratory off the third-floor passage he had surveyed in his first year. The boy had brewed the late stages of it in a hut at the edge of the forbidden forest on the night of the new moon of April. The body was a pale, slim thing with no nose worth the name, and with eyes the color of old wine. It was the body the Wraith had begun, in his teaching years on the continent, to plan as a successor to his second body, and which he had not in his fall had occasion to commission. The body could hold a wand. That was, for a body, the only quality which mattered. The boy was 12 by the school's calendar and 13 by the Wraith's. Quirrell had been released on the night of the brewing's completion, with the small, clean precision the Wraith reserved for tools whose service had been completed without error. The boy had attended the release. He had watched without expression. He had committed to the room behind the door marked vault the small, dispassionate observation that a man's life ended, by the Wraith's preferred method, in the same small, quiet way a candle ended when the wick was pinched. In the second year the Wraith took no public action. He rested. He let the wizarding world settle into the small, uncertain shape it had taken after the death of Albus Dumbledore. He let McGonagall, in her new chair, develop the small administrative habits of a headmistress who had not, in her 38 years of teaching, expected to occupy it. He let Severus Snape, in the small private grief Snape had taken from his old master's death, and the small private gratitude Snape had taken from the boy's polite refusal, in 3 teas at the Slytherin head of house study across the autumn, to discuss the headmaster's death, let Snape settle, in the small, slow way of a man whose loyalties had been resorted by the simple expedient of one of them having died, into a small, adjusted teacher of the boy. He let Snape, in particular, decide that the boy was bright, polite, possibly an ally, and very probably not what the late headmaster had feared. Snape would, in the year ahead, be of use. The Wraith did not, in the second year, contact any of the surviving Death Eaters. He did not, in the second year, contact any of the surviving members of the Wizengamot. He did not, in the second year, write a single owl. He let his body recover from its brewing. He let the boy continue, in the small public posture of a precocious second-year Slytherin, who was the favorite student of his potions master and the respected confidant of his year-mates, the small public discipline of a polite child who had been bereaved by an accident. The Wraith and the boy met in the night, in the small unused chamber off the Slytherin common room which the Wraith had secured against the school's wards by methods the school had not, since the death of its previous headmaster, retained any expertise capable of detecting. The chamber was furnished, by the end of the autumn, with a desk and 2 chairs. The Wraith sat in the larger chair. The boy sat in the smaller. They spoke, in the small private register the Wraith had used in the cupboard, of the architecture of the year ahead. The Wraith laid out on the desk, in small, careful slips of paper which neither of them ever permitted to leave the chamber, the names of the surviving Death Eaters by category, the loyal but bought, the lapsed, the dangerous, and the boy memorized them. The Wraith laid out in the same slips of paper the architecture of the post-Dumbledore Wizengamot, the small, careful balance of factions the Light had assembled in its 11 years of recovery, the small balance points the Wraith had identified, the small individual private grievances of each chair which could, in the year ahead, be converted into a vote. The boy memorized them. The Wraith laid out on the desk, on the first night of his second year, in the small slip of paper which would become the slip the boy carried in the inside pocket of his school robes for the remainder of the year, the names of the 7 Order of the Phoenix members who had, in the 11 years since the fall of 1981, kept the small, careful flame of Albus Dumbledore's resistance alive. Sirius Black Azkaban, irrelevant. Remus Lupin, active. Alastor Moody, active. Kingsley Shacklebolt, active. Auror, Arabella Figg, passive. Squib, Mundungus Fletcher, active. Criminal. Aberforth Dumbledore, passive. Publican. The Wraith said, "These are the 7. The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "We will deal with them by the end of your 4th year." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "We will not deal with them in the order their names appear on this slip. We will deal with them in the order their absences will, by the time of our final move, be least noticed." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "Mundungus Fletcher will be the first. He will be removed before the end of your 2nd year, by methods which will not, in their execution, attract any attention except his own. He will, in his removal, not be reported missing for some weeks. By the time he is reported missing, He will have been long enough gone that his disappearance will be ascribed to the small, ordinary accident of his trade. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, Arabella Fig will be the second. She will be removed in the summer between your second and third years. She will be removed in such a way that her removal will, in the small, careful obituary of an old squib on a Muggle street, attract no attention even within the order. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, Remus Lupin will be the third. Remus Lupin is, of the 7, the one with the most extensive social contact within the order's wider sympathizer network, and whose absence will accordingly be felt most quickly. We will, however, find an opportunity to remove him through a method which will produce a small public apparent suicide in the autumn of your third year. The apparent suicide will be attributed, by the small public sympathy of the wizarding world for werewolves, to the small loneliness of a man whose schoolboy friends had all preceded him into death. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, Aberforth Dumbledore will be the fourth. He will be removed in the winter of your third year by an apparent fire at the Hog's Head Inn in Hogsmeade. The fire will be attributable to the small carelessness of an elderly publican with a candle. The order will lose in the fire its main meeting place in the south. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, Alastair Moody and Kingsley Shacklebolt will be the 5th and 6th. They will be removed by direct means, by hands of mine, in the early summer of your 4th year, in the days of the assault on the ministry. They are, of the 7, the only 2 who will be expected to fight back. We will accordingly take them at the moment in which the wider population's attention has been arranged elsewhere. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, Sirius Black will be the 7th. We will not, in fact, remove him. He is, by my arrangement at the Ministry's Records Department, still on file at Azkaban. He will remain there. He is in his small mad cell of no use to the Order. He is in his presence a small public reminder of the Order's failure to defend its own. He is, alive, a small public injury to the Order's reputation. We will in your 4th year leave him. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, that is the Order. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, the ministry will be a different matter. The 2nd year passed. Mundungus Fletcher was found drowned in the Thames in May. The inquest conducted by a Muggle coroner in a Muggle office attributed the drowning to a small, ordinary accident of a small, ordinary thief. The wizarding press did not, in May, report the drowning. The Order met in June at the Hog's Head, and Remus Lupin reported, in the small, careful tone of a man who had not wished to bring the news to the table, that one of their lesser members had been missed for 2 months, and that an inquiry by Mundungus's small set of fences had produced the Muggle coroner's report. The Order in its meeting marked Mundungus as the small, ordinary loss of an irregular member and continued. Arabella Fig died in her sleep in August. The death was discovered in the small, ordinary way by the postman of Privet Drive. The cause, by the small, ordinary Muggle inquiry which followed, was a small, ordinary failure of the heart in an old woman of 71. Her cats, of which there had been 10, were variously taken in by neighbors. The Order at its September meeting marked her absence by a small minute of silence and continued. In September of the boy's 3rd year, he was presented. The presentation took place on the night of the new moon, in the long disused dining hall of the old Lestrange Manor in Wiltshire, which the wraith had quietly opened, claimed, and rewarded by an arrangement of 3 of his loyalist pureblood agents over the previous summer. The dining hall held on the night of the presentation the 47 surviving Death Eaters whose loyalty the wraith had verified by individual private interview over the spring. They knelt in 3 lines of 15 and 1 of 2, in the silence the wraith had instructed them to keep. They wore the robes they had not worn in 11 years. They had been told, by way of a small printed card delivered to each by a small unobtrusive owl, that their master had returned. They had been told, in addition, that their master would, this evening, present them with his heir. The wraith stood at the long high end of the dining hall. He stood in his new body beside a long ebony chair on which the boy was sitting. The boy was, by the school's calendar, 13, by the wraith's 15. He was dressed, this evening, in the small ceremonial robes of the heir of the House of Slytherin, which the wraith had retrieved from the small inner room of the Lestrange vault. The robes were green, the deep green of the Slytherin banner, with silver at the cuff and a small silver sigil at the breast. The boy wore them with the small, precise carriage which had been written into him at 4. The wraith said, in the thin, high voice which had been the voice in the boy's head for 13 years, and which was now also the voice in the dining hall, "My friends." The 47 did not, in any motion of attention, lift their heads. The wraith said, "I have, after 11 years, returned. I have returned in part by the methods I taught you to expect. I have returned in part by methods which were not, when I left you in my plan. I have, in the years of my absence, conducted a single piece of work. The piece of work has been the education of my heir. The 47 did not move. The wraith said, "He is beside me on the chair. He is, by my calendar, 15, by his own 13. He has been my pupil since the first night of his life. He has been raised by no other voice than mine. He is, by every measure I am able to take, what I would have made of myself if I had had me as a teacher when I was him." The 47 did not move. The wraith said, "He is my son." He paused. He said, "You will, when I name him, kneel to him." He paused. He said, "He is Harry Potter." There was, for the count of 3, no sound in the room. In the count of 4, the closest of the kneeling Death Eaters, a thin man with a small white scar across one eyebrow whom the wraith had identified to the boy in the cupboard at age 9 as Avery, second of his name, age 43, Loyal, lifted his head. He looked at the boy. He looked at the boy for the count of 1. He looked at the boy's face. He looked at the boy's scar. In the count of 2, he laid his forehead on the floor. The other 46 in the count of 3 after Avery followed. The wraith said, "Rise." They rose. He went, with the boy beside him at his shoulder, down the long aisle between the 4 lines of kneeling Death Eaters. He addressed each of the 47 by name. The boy beside him met each of the 47's eyes for the count of 1. The boy did not, in any of the 47 small countings, fail to be remembered. By the end of the evening, the wraith had reconstituted his court. The court had a new convention. The court would now address 2 masters. The court was instructed, in the small, careful conventions of the wraith's old administration, in the small new conventions which would, in the year ahead, allow the boy to be addressed as the second name. The court would address the boy as the heir. The wraith would, in due course, restore his own old name to the form in which the court had used it. The boy would, in due course, be given a name of his own which the court would use as the second name. In the meantime, by the wraith's order, neither name would be spoken outside the dining hall. In the 3rd year, the school did not detect. Snape, in his small, adjusted teacher's confidence in the boy, did not detect. McGonagall, in her small, overbusy headmistress's anxiety, did not detect. Remus Lupin, who had been appointed defense against the dark arts professor for the year by McGonagall in the small, useful order alliance she had inherited from her predecessor, watched the boy through the autumn with the small, careful attention of a man who had been told, on the night of his appointment, by the small, careful headmistress, that the boy was a precocious, quiet 3rd year of whom they were all somewhat proud and somewhat uncertain. He watched the boy in class. He watched the boy in the corridors. He watched the boy at meals. He saw in the watching a polite, quiet 3rd year who answered his questions correctly and who did not, in his demeanor, give the small adult defense professor any reason to be afraid. He was found in the early morning of the 1st of November in his small private rooms at the school. He had died, by the small obvious account of the inquiry, of a self-administered dose of an order-issued potion against the small periodic pain of his condition. The note he had left, in the small neat handwriting which had been Remus Lupin's all his life, and which had been, the wraith identified to the boy in the small chamber off the common room that evening, the work of a forgery the wraith had set ready by a small specialist of his court in late September, addressed the small loneliness of a man whose schoolboy friends had all preceded him into death, and the small unsustainable cost of a life lived inside the small periodic burden of the wolf. And the small relief he had wished for some time to take. The note was found at the foot of the bed. The Daily Prophet, in the next morning's edition, ran a small, dignified obituary. McGonagall closed the defense chair for the remainder of the term. The order met 2 days later at the Hog's Head, and marked Remus Lupin's absence by a small minute of silence and continued. In the winter, the Hog's Head burned. The fire, by the Hogsmeade Fire Brigade's small account, was a small ordinary accident of an elderly publican with a candle. The order, in the small displaced misery of the new year, met at 12 Grimmauld Place for the remainder of its meeting. There were, at this point, 4 of them left: Moody, Shacklebolt, an older witch named Hestia Jones, whom the wraith had identified as not on the slip of 7 because her engagement with the order was, in his estimation, a matter of small social courtesy rather than operational commitment, and 1 further witch named Emmeline Vance, whom the wraith had identified similarly. The 4 met in the small dark parlor of 12 Grimmauld Place in the spring of the boy's 3rd year, and concluded, in the small reluctant tone of seasoned operatives, that there was now, in any meaningful sense, no order. In the spring of the boy's 3rd year, the wraith took the second matter in hand. He took the ministry. He took it slowly. He took it by the small patient methods he had taught the boy in the cupboard installments of the curriculum. He identified, by means of the boy's small careful legilimency at small social functions in the spring, the precise 3 departmental heads whose private grievances could, with the appropriate adjustment, be converted into the appropriate votes. He took the 3. He took them by, in 2 cases, the offer of small private remediations of long-standing professional disappointments, and in the third by the small, careful application of pressure on a private indiscretion the Wraith had identified in a private letter. He took them. He installed in the small adjusted positions which the 3 new alliances allowed him, the small careful personnel of his own court, Lucius Malfoy in the Department of International Magical Cooperation, Mulciber in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's Auxiliary Office, and a small precise witch named Selwyn, whose name the boy had been given in the cupboard at age 4 in the Department of Mysteries. The installations were made in the spring by the small careful management of 3 by-elections which the Minister of Magic at the time, a small busy man named Cornelius Fudge, did not consider to be of any consequence. In the summer of the boy's 3rd year, Lucius Malfoy hosted the Minister of Magic at his estate in Wiltshire. The dinner was a small private one. The dinner included among the guests a tall pale man whom Lucius introduced to the minister as a private business advisor of the Malfoy estate. The advisor said little at dinner. The advisor did not, in any motion of attention, allow the minister to see his eyes for longer than the small countings of a polite social meeting. By the end of the dinner, the minister had been given to understand that he would, in the autumn, be retiring on a small private pension, which the Malfoy estate would, by a small careful arrangement, be augmenting. In September of the boy's 4th year, Cornelius Fudge retired. The Wisengamot in the small careful by-election which followed, elected as his successor a witch named Pew's Thickness, whose nomination had been advanced by a small careful coalition of 3 departments under the small careful management of the Wraith's 3 by-election alliances. Thickness was the Wraith's man. He had been, since the early summer, under the small careful Imperius the Wraith had been refining on his court for the year. He did not, however, appear in the carriage of his small public office to be anyone's man. He carried the appearance of a small busy ministry administrator who had been promoted, by a small lucky alignment of factions, to the chair of the country. He did so for the term of the autumn. In October of the boy's 4th year, the Wraith and the boy went out to deal with Moody and Shacklebolt. They went, on the night of the new moon of October, to 12 Grimmauld Place. They went with 3 Death Eaters whom the Wraith had selected for the small specific purpose. They breached the house by the small careful manipulation of the small old wards which the original Fidelius had, in the years of its decay since 1981, allowed to lapse. They entered the small dark parlor. They found Moody and Shacklebolt at the small kitchen table at the back of the house, with Hestia Jones and Emmeline Vance, in a small meeting of the 4 remaining Order members at which it had been decided, by a small reluctant vote, to dissolve. The 4 did not, in any of the 4 small countings of their last second, expect the breach. It was over in 12 seconds. The Wraith permitted in the 12 seconds the boy to take Moody. The boy took him. The boy took him by a small careful application of a curse the Wraith had given him in the cupboard at Privet Drive on the night of the boy's 10th birthday. In fact, the small precise curse which the Wraith had identified for Moody, by reason of the small old curse scar Moody had carried across the left side of his face for 30 years, and which would, in the small careful resonance the Wraith had described, admit the small careful entry of a related curse without raising the small careful resistive shields which had been Moody's only meaningful protection for those 30 years. The boy applied the curse. Moody, in the small even count of 1, ceased to be the body of an old Auror and became the small still shape of a man whose long career had been concluded. The Wraith permitted the boy, in addition, to take Shacklebolt. The boy took him by a different and faster method. The Wraith took Hestia Jones and Emmeline Vance himself, in 2 clean countings which left no marks on either body. He left the 4 bodies in the small dark parlor. He took, on the way out, the small leather folder of order minutes which the small dark parlor contained, and which he had been wanting for 11 years. The order in the morning's small Auror inquiry was reported missing. By the end of October, in the small reluctant front-page report of the Daily Prophet, the Auror office had concluded that an unknown party had conducted, in the small dark parlor, a small dark act for which there was, in the office's records, no immediate precedent. The Auror office had been, by the small careful arrangement of the Wraith's appointments to its auxiliary, gutted of 3 of its 5 most senior staff over the summer. The remaining 2 were the dead. The investigation was, by the end of October, transferred to a small junior team. The small junior team had, by the end of November, lost the file. In December of the boy's 4th year, the Wraith called the Wisengamot. The Wisengamot met, in extraordinary session, in the high chamber of the Ministry of Magic on the morning of December the 11th. The agenda for the session, in the small printed card delivered to each of the chairs by a small unobtrusive owl on the previous day, was a single item: a vote on the dissolution of the Order of the Phoenix as a registered political body and the reclassification of its remaining property, accounts, and historical archives under the small ordinary administration of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The agenda was in the small printed card, noted as a piece of small administrative housekeeping required by the small recent loss of the Order's last 4 registered members. The Wisengamot assembled at 10. They assembled in the high-tiered chamber under the stone vault in the small ordinary purple robes of their office. They assembled, all 50 of them, with the small ordinary expectation of a routine session whose only business had been described as small administrative housekeeping. At 11, the Minister of Magic Pew's thickness, with the small steady glaze of a man who had not, in his small steady glaze, been required to make a decision of his own in some months, opened the floor. At 11:01, the doors of the high-tiered chamber closed. They closed not by the small ordinary mechanism by which the doors closed at the end of each session, but by a small careful charm the Wraith had applied that morning by Selwyn of the Department of Mysteries. The doors, by the small careful charm, would not open until they were instructed to. At 11:02, the Wraith entered. He entered through the small private door behind the minister's bench, which had been, since 1944, the small private door reserved for the small private entries of the minister's official advisors. He entered in his new body. He wore the small black robe of an old wizarding family of no particular party. He carried no wand visible. He walked in the unhurried small steps of a man whose hour had come to the small lectern at the center of the floor. He stopped at the lectern. The boy entered behind him. The boy was 16 by the Wraith's calendar and 14 by the school's. He was dressed this morning in the small ceremonial robes of the heir of the House of Slytherin, which the Wraith had retrieved from the Lestrange vault in his second year. He carried in his right hand his wand. He stopped a careful pace behind the Wraith. The Wraith looked up across the rows of the Wisengamot. He let the rows look at him. In the count of 3, the rows recognized him. There were in the small first count of recognition 3 small gasps, 2 small attempts at a private wand which were prevented by the small efficient hands of a small unobtrusive Death Eater the Wraith had placed in each row earlier in the morning, and a small careful silence which spread in the count of 4 from row to row. In the count of 5, the Wisengamot understood that the doors were closed. In the count of 6, the Wisengamot understood that the Wraith had come back. In the count of 7, the Wisengamot understood that the small piece of administrative housekeeping for which they had assembled was not the small piece of administrative housekeeping for which they had assembled. The Wraith said in the high thin voice which had been the voice in the boy's head for 13 years and which was now the voice of the highest chamber in the country, "Good morning." He paused. He said, "I should like to begin this morning by introducing my colleague." He turned. He gestured to the boy. The boy stepped forward to a careful position beside him. The Wraith said in the small, clear, instructive register which had been the register of the cupboard at Privet Drive, "He is my heir. He is, beside me, the small adult presence under whose ceremonial co-signature the proceedings of this body will, from this hour forward, be conducted. He is, in the small public sense which the chamber will require for the records of the by-election which will, in the afternoon, ratify the small adjustment of our governance, he is, in this hour, named." He paused. He said, "He is Harry Potter." There was, in the small startled count of 3 after the name, no further sound in the chamber. In the count of 4, the Wisengamot remembered who Harry Potter was. In the count of 5, the Wisengamot remembered, individually, in their 50 private heads, the small ordinary tabloid stories they had read for 14 years about the small ordinary survival of the small ordinary boy of the small ordinary lightning scar. The Wisengamot remembered that the small ordinary boy had, in the small ordinary obituary of his late headmaster, been reported as a polite small first year of Slytherin who had had the misfortune to be present at the headmaster's small accidental death. The Wisengamot remembered in the further reaches of the small startled count that the small ordinary boy of the small ordinary lightning scar was now, by the small ordinary mathematics of 14 years and 1 new headmaster, somewhere between the small ordinary 14 and the small ordinary 15. The Wisengamot did not remember the boy as the heir of the man at the lectern. The Wisengamot saw him, however, as the heir of the man at the lectern. The boy stood in the unhurried small steps of his ceremonial pace beside the Wraith. He let the high stone vault and the high-tiered chamber rest on him. He did not, by any motion of attention, register the Wisengamot's count. The wraith said in the high, thin voice which had become, in the count of 9 after the doors closed, the voice of the country, "We are here this morning to dissolve the Light faction." He paused. He said, "The Light faction has, in the small accelerated history of the past 3 years, lost its last formal organization. It has lost its founding figure. It has lost its successor cadres. It has lost the order which has, since 1970, been the small operational instrument of its policy. It has in this hour no body, no head, and no hands. It is, in the simple administrative sense which this chamber is competent to determine, no longer a faction." He paused. He said, "We will this morning recognize this in a small administrative motion. The small administrative motion will reclassify the Light faction's remaining property, accounts, and historical archives under the small ordinary administration of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The small administrative motion will, in addition, dissolve the small ordinary Wisengamot conventions which have, since 1971, been required for the small operational convenience of the Light's daily participation in our debates. We will, in the afternoon, take up the small adjusted Wisengamot conventions which will replace them." He paused. "The vote is in the small ordinary procedure of this chamber, a piece of paper which each of you holds. You will, by the small ordinary procedure, mark the paper iron and place it in the small ordinary urn which Selwyn of the Department of Mysteries will, in the next minute, carry along the rows. You will, in the marking, mark I." He paused. He said, "I should very much like to be clear, in the small civic interest of the chamber, that there is in this hour no opportunity to mark nay. The doors are sealed. The wands are not, in this hour, capable of producing any spell. The records of this morning's vote will, by the small careful administration of this chamber's records office, indicate a unanimous result. The small administrative motion is, accordingly, expected to pass." He paused. He said, "I will not, in the small public interest of this chamber, take any action against any chair which marks nay. The chair will be permitted by the small ordinary procedure to leave the chamber at the end of the morning's session and to return to its small ordinary daily life. The chair will, however, have an entry in its small private record at the records office which will be of small ordinary administrative interest to those of us whose interest in the small daily life of our colleagues is the work of our private hours." He paused. He said, "Mark, the 50 marked. In the small careful counting of the vote by Selwyn at the small ordinary urn, 49 were aye, 1 was nay." The wraith looked across the rows. He did not, by any motion of attention, identify the chair which had marked nay. He said, "The motion passes." He said, "We will, in the afternoon, take up the small adjusted Wisengamot convention." He said, "The chamber is, until the afternoon, dismissed." The doors opened. The 50 filed out. They filed out, in the small careful pace of 50 wizards and witches who had just understood, in the small careful procedure of a vote, that the country had changed under them between breakfast and tea. They filed out with their hands in the small careful pockets of their robes, and their faces in the small careful expressions of 50 civilly observant members of a body which had, this morning, conducted a small administrative motion. The boy watched them file. He watched them with the small even attention which had been the attention of the cupboard at Privet Drive for 14 years. In the small careful pause after the last of the 50 had filed out, the wraith turned to the boy. He said, in the high thin voice which was now the small private voice of a small private conversation between the wraith and the boy in a high-tiered chamber under a stone vault in the highest building in the country, "Well done," the boy said in the cupboard register. "Yes." In the afternoon, the chamber took up the small adjusted Wisengamot convention. The small adjusted conventions established, in the small careful procedural language which had been drafted by Lucius Malfoy and Selwyn over the small careful course of the previous month, a small adjusted office at the head of the Wisengamot which would be occupied in perpetuity by a small adjusted figure to be styled the Lord Protector. The small adjusted office of Lord Protector would be appointed by the small adjusted vote of the Wisengamot at the moment of its small adjusted institution and would, by the small careful adjustment of the conventions, not subsequently require any small adjusted ratification by the small ordinary mechanisms of the chamber. The small adjusted office of Lord Protector would have a small adjusted heir, named at the small adjusted moment of the small adjusted institution. The vote on the small adjusted conventions was, in the small careful procedure of the afternoon, unanimous. The first Lord Protector of the Wisengamot was, in the small careful nomination of the afternoon, the small, tall, pale man in the small black robe of an old wizarding family of no particular party. The heir of the Lord Protector was, in the small, careful additional nomination of the afternoon, the small ceremonial figure in the small green robes of the House of Slytherin. The chamber rose, the chamber bowed. In the small, careful evening of December the 11th, the Wraith and the boy left the high chamber and went, by the small, careful private corridor behind the minister's bench, down the small, careful staircase which led to the small, careful private stair, which led to the small, careful entrance of the Department of Mysteries. They went into the Department of Mysteries. They walked in the small, unhurried steps which had brought them to the chamber that morning, through the small set of rooms which the department was, by its small, careful purpose, set up to contain. They walked through the small room of the rotating doors. They walked through the small room of the brain. They walked through the small room of the time-turners. They came, at the small, careful end of the route the Wraith had drawn for the boy in the cupboard installments of the previous June, to the small room of the Veil. The room of the Veil was a small stone amphitheater with a small raised dais at its center. On the dais stood a small stone arch. Across the arch hung a small thin veil which moved as if in a small breeze in a room in which there was no breeze. The Wraith stopped at the foot of the dais. The boy stopped beside him. The Wraith said, "This is the small private boundary of our work." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "It is the only place in our country in which the small careful conventions of our administration meet, head-on, the small ordinary fact of the dead." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "I should very much like in the small private hour of our small private accession to stand with you in front of it." The boy said, "Yes." They stood for a small careful count which neither of them attempted to measure at the foot of the dais. The veil moved, the room held still. The Wraith said, "I have in the long quiet decade of your education not used the word son." The boy said, "Number." The Wraith said, "I have used the word heir. I have used the word pupil. I have used the word vessel. I have used the word on the night of October at Hogwarts in our first meeting in this body, son. I have not in the small interval since repeated the word." The boy said, "Number." The Wraith said, "I will in this small careful hour at the foot of this veil repeat it." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "My son." The boy said, "In the cupboard register, in the register which was the register of a 16-year-old who had been raised by the patient teacher he had heard whispering at him in the cupboard at Privet Drive since the night of the basket, 'Father.'" The Wraith said, "We will in due course also pass through the veil. We will pass through it by the small careful arrangement of an administration which has no further enemies, when we have decided that we have had in our small careful occupation of this country enough." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "We will not this evening decide that we have had enough." The boy said, "Number." The Wraith said, "We will this evening retire to the small private dining room of the Lord Protector's residence at the Ministry." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "We will, in the small private dining room, take a small private dinner together as father and son. We will be brought by Selwyn the small private file of the small chair which marked nay this morning. We will inspect the file, we will decide what to do with the chair, we will in the small private decision agree." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "We will in the small private hour after the small private dinner sleep." The boy said, "Yes." The Wraith said, "Tomorrow we will begin the small careful business of the country." The boy said, "Yes." They turned. They walked in the unhurried small steps which had brought them to the foot of the veil, back through the small room of the time-turners and the small room of the brains and the small room of the rotating doors and the small careful entrance of the Department of Mysteries and the small careful private stair and the small careful private corridor and the small careful private exit which led out onto the great atrium of the Ministry of Magic. The atrium was empty. The fountain at its center, which had since 1971 depicted in small ceremonial silver and gold a wizard, a witch, a centaur, a goblin, and a house elf gazing up at the wizard, had been, in the small careful instruction of the Wraith over the previous week, replaced by a small ceremonial green stone obelisk inscribed in old runes with the small careful motto of the new administration. The motto, in the Wraith's old hand, in the old language which he had been writing in his small private journals since he was 16, read, "Magic is patience." The boy looked at the obelisk. He looked at it for the small careful count of 3. He thought internally in the cupboard register, in the small private way the Wraith had not entered in 8 years and 10 months, he means it. He thought internally, it is the motto of his teaching. He thought internally, it is the motto of my life. The Wraith said externally in the high thin voice which was now the high thin voice of the country, "Come, my son." The boy said, "Yes, father." They left the atrium. The ministry settled into its small quiet new shape under the small careful hands of its small adjusted administration. The country, by the morning of the next day, would have a Lord Protector and an heir, and a small, ordinary obelisk in the place of its old fountain. It would, by the spring, have a small, careful new set of school curricula in the small, ordinary public schools, and a small, careful new register of Muggle-born births in the small, ordinary records office, and a small, careful new department in the ministry whose name, in the small, careful headlines of the Daily Prophet, would be the Department of Heritage. It would, by the summer, have a small, careful new set of treaties with the small, careful continental ministries which had, in the small, careful 11 years since 1981, been waiting for the small, careful return of a partner whose government had, by their small, careful judgment, been the only competent one of the previous century. The light in the small, ordinary administrative phrasing of the Wisengamot's small private records office had been dissolved. The boy in the small, ordinary administrative phrasing of the Wisengamot's small public records office was the heir. The wraith in the small, ordinary administrative phrasing of his own small private journals had, after a long, quiet decade of patience and a small, loud decade of work, finished the small, patient work he had begun, on the doorstep of number 4, Privet Drive, on the morning of the 2nd of November in the year 1981. In the small private dining room of the Lord Protector's residence that evening, in the warm yellow light of the small ordinary candles, the two of them sat across the small private table. There was soup, there was bread. There was a small private bottle of a small private wine the wraith had brought up from the Riddle cellar at Little Hangleton, which had been kept on the racks since the year of his grandfather. There was the small private file of the small chair which had marked nay. The wraith opened the file, he inspected it, he passed it across the table to the boy. The boy read, the boy looked up at his father. He said in the cupboard register, in the register which was now the register of the heir of the Lord Protector of the country, he is the chair from the Department of Heritage. The wraith said, he is. The boy said, he has on the small chair 3 children. The wraith said, he has. The boy said, the eldest is a girl of 9, the middle is a boy of 7, and the youngest is a girl of 4. The wraith said, she is. The boy said, we will, in the small, careful application of pressure, not take action against the chair. We will, in the small, careful application of pressure, recruit him. The wraith looked at the boy. He looked at the boy in the small, even way he had looked at the boy on the night of the basket, 11 years and a small, careful month ago, in the small, careful light of the doorstep of number 4 Privet Drive. He looked, in the small, even way, at the small, adult face of the small, even pupil he had built. He said in the high, thin voice which was now the small, private voice of a small, private conversation in a small, private dining room, very good. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, Selwyn will arrange the small, careful application of pressure in the morning. The boy said, yes. The wraith said, rest. The boy said, yes. They finished the soup and the bread and the small, careful wine. They went by the small, private stair behind the small, private dining room, up to the small, careful bedrooms in which the small, careful house elves of the Lord Protector's residence had laid out their small, careful night clothes. The boy undressed. He folded his clothes, put on the small, careful nightshirt. He climbed into the small, careful bed. In the small, careful candlelight, in the small, careful quiet of the small, careful residence, in the small, careful country which had this morning, by the small, careful procedure of a single morning's vote, come into the small, careful hands of an administration which had been 12 years in the making, the wraith said internally, in the cupboard register he had used in the cupboard at Privet Drive since the night of the basket, rest. The boy said internally, in the cupboard register he had used in his own small, careful interior for the same 14 years, yes. The wraith said internally, tomorrow we begin. The boy said internally, yes. Outside the small, careful windows of the small, careful residence, the small, careful December snow began. Chapter 7 end.